Crystal, she.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today we're gonna discuss the white supremacist social system and the Democratic Party, and as well as the enduring poverty of the Black poor altogether. But to begin today's discussion, we'll first have Jeremiah, and I'm not sure who else, but they'll be reading the upcoming issue of Avant-Garde's editorial statement, which I think will be an issue dedicated to James Baldwin. And so I'll first turn over to Jeremiah, and then we'll have the discussion for today.
Yeah. So we're working on issue 3 of Avant-Garde, like Emily said, and many people in this room are working on articles for this 3rd issue, which we're planning to publish in October-ish, although we don't have like a firm date set. But yeah, we have a lot of people working on different essays, obviously drawing from Baldwin, and I think drawing from Baldwin's philosophy, his way of interrogating society, and so it's been really exciting, especially because part of our task, I think, for this issue has been to try to capture the continued ideological development of the free school, and also just what's happening in the world and in the nation, and to try to kind of be on top of that, but to also try to push it forward in terms of our thinking. And so I took a first stab at drafting the editorial statement and talked about it with Michelle, Jahan, Serafina, and then also sent it to Doug. And then, so yeah, I'll read this current draft, and it might change over the next few weeks, but a lot of this is stuff that will sound familiar to everyone because, yeah, again, like we're trying to do justice to everything that's the most urgent and top of mind for like where free school's also at. And we haven't fully decided on like a title for the issue yet, but yeah, we're working that stuff out. So yeah, okay, I'll read the current draft of the editorial statement. I'm also interested to hear if people have feedback. A complete century has passed since the birth of James Arthur Baldwin on August 2nd, 1924, in Harlem. We dedicate the 3rd issue of Avant-Garde to Baldwin with the conviction that the next 100 years, the lives of our children and our children's children, may well be defined by his ideas, philosophy, language, and vision of our human future. James Baldwin was a revolutionary, and not only for his time, but for ours. He sets the standard as an indispensable revolutionary thinker for the 21st century. For those who travel the road in search of profound social change, Baldwin is inescapable. Small wonder, then, that the ruling class of this country is intent on dominating the discourse surrounding Baldwin in this year of his centenary. By repackaging him as a fashionable commodity to fill 5-minute television segments, they aim to destroy Baldwin, consign him to irrelevance in an imagined past. To this are added efforts to fabricate an image of Baldwin in the mold of a quote-unquote queer writer, an empty vessel for postmodern identity politics, which emanate from elite cultural institutions. As a seer of the American revolutionary process, and a towering philosopher of freedom and consciousness, Baldwin is unknown and unwanted by career intellectuals, bourgeois liberals, and the Marxist left alike. He is, however, fully known and loved by the people who produced him, the Black proletariat. He remains a prophet of and for the Black poor. Indeed, Baldwin saw himself as a native son of the Black proletariat, an inheritor of his people's journey from slavery to emancipation and Reconstruction through Jim Crow and the Great Migration. This chronology imbued Baldwin, as it did W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, Lorraine Hansberry, Charles White, Diane Nash, James Lawson, and many others, with a unique vision into the life of the Black folk, and further, into the vast human problem of America's white supremacist system. Armed with this knowledge, Baldwin strode into the crucible of the civil rights movement. as nonviolent armies waged pitched battles across the South and North to transform the public square and penetrate the human heart, so too did he force a rupture in the nation's consciousness, to show white Americans how desperately they were imprisoned by whiteness, a false identity trapped in its own creation of the quote-unquote inferior Black race. Baldwin knew the private lives of his countrymen, Black and white. He laid bare how white supremacy suffocates the democratic capacity of our citizenry, rendering us helplessly dependent on a murderous regime of laws and myths to give us an infantile sense of reality, shielded from Black suffering, protected from the darker hordes massing at the empire's gates. Today, Baldwin's interrogation of white modernity, of the US state and its pretensions of democracy, must be treated as a theoretical innovation in revolutionary science. He emerged as God's revolutionary voice in the wilderness of American society, bearing witness to the coming of a new people. He spoke of America becoming the last white nation, the last great empire, the final standard bearer of the Western epoch, and the bridge leading to far greater democratic vistas toward a civilization of peace. The battle over James Baldwin is thus a battle between the people's consciousness and the ideology of the ruling elite. It is, furthermore, a battle for peace and the possibilities of revolutionary change. In America and throughout our world, a titanic struggle is now taking place between the old and the new. These are dark days. Clouds of war gather, strike, and kill in Gaza. Still greater storms of world war loom on the horizon. Humanity stands aghast at the depravity of Western civilization, whose principal representatives, the American ruling elite and their Zionist accomplices, would precipitate Armageddon in their desperate attempt to hold on to power, to hold back time itself. Domestically, the United States hangs on the edge of civil war, unending social chaos, or revolutionary change. The American people see their nation in decline. They see and feel suffering everywhere. And in their overwhelming majority, they see their rulers and institutions as totally bankrupt. For the white poor, the wages of whiteness no longer pay as they once did. For the Black poor, the air stings and bleeds with an even more painful sense of betrayal. No amount of propaganda can disguise the fact that the American empire's hurtling path toward cataclysm and ruin could, in the end, bring the death of the American nation itself. Here lies the crisis of our time, and it is for this crisis that Baldwin offers answers. For him, the role of the artist is tasked with the revolutionary, to reveal the beloved to themselves. Alongside Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin matters today because he reveals to the people their own role as makers of history. Who will take responsibility for this country in its future? Who will deliver our children from the jaws of a society designed to kill them? Baldwin clarifies the moral choice that compels each of us to say with full faith, I will. Far beneath the hulking spectacle of any electoral machine, he insisted that true democracy begins in the moral standards to which we hold ourselves. It begins when the despised and discontented realize that the battle of ideas, the scale of the future, belongs to them to decide. It begins, for instance, when a people says they will not pledge allegiance to a political party that proposes Black freedom is compatible with war, immiseration, and genocide. Such is the spirit that fills the year of James Baldwin, God's revolutionary voice, the year-long crusade from which this issue springs. With Baldwin as their meeting ground, the people of Philadelphia and other cities are discovering each other anew, are discovering their common destiny as inheritors of that revolution for which Baldwin stood. If we are to survive the storms ahead, if we are to renew ourselves as a people, it is the values of the Third American Revolution that will take us through. This was a new type of revolution. It crystallized and birthed new understandings about human beings and their capacity for struggle. We have not yet unearthed the full weight and potential of our inheritance. Yet we do know this. Baldwin, equally with King and all the pioneers of the Black freedom movement, devoted his life to love as a revolutionary antidote to transform an inhuman social order. That work, as Baldwin wrote, is not yet finished. By the light of these agonizing hours, we pick up the mantle of James Baldwin, for he pierced through the human dimensions of our American problem and spoke, in the clearest terms, to mankind's ongoing quest for freedom. He is every one of us. Through Baldwin, we press forward into new regions of revolutionary thought. Mark the time. James Baldwin lives, he breathes, he speaks again. Yeah, that's the current draft. And as you can tell, we tried to incorporate a lot of what we've been talking about in free school recently. And I think personally, we've been trying to work out this question of how do we write editorial statements, going back to the very first issue. And it's an ongoing process, I think. And we're trying to find the right tone for it, the right approach to it. It's very similar to how we would write, event mission statements, but also something slightly different. And part of what's also really helpful is, in writing this, because I was writing the first draft, we've also been meeting periodically with different writers for this issue. And getting a sense of what people are thinking through, the ideological questions that we're working out. And so it's also trying to do justice to that without obviously doing all of trying to answer every question. But yeah, I really think people, I guess the unique thing about this moment is people are drawn, I think we recognize that people are very drawn to James Baldwin. And it appears both in the work that we do with, especially the celebration and the ongoing work with the, the exhibit, people coming out, and just the excitement that we've been seeing in the reading groups and all that. And then obviously on the national stage, I think Baldwin is being misused by the ruling elite and by elite institutions. But I think on the other hand, I think people, at least from what I see on social media, are still very drawn to Baldwin and drawn to him as a kind of a moral voice who speaks for them to make sense of what's happening in the world, and to make sense of what it means to be, a moral human being in this time. But I think part of our task, which is a task that I don't think anyone else will take up, as in the task for the free school, is we believe that there are, like we said, regions of thought, regions of revolutionary science that have not yet been fully explored yet or fully developed yet. And we see our task as Baldwin representing that new region of revolutionary thought, which we've been working out throughout the course of this year and will continue to work out for the remainder of this year, Baldwin, and moving forward. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at. We have, I won't go through all the different essays we have unless people want to hear it, but yeah, like Michelle, Sarah, and anyone else should feel free to. Also, other people who are working essays for the issue should also feel free to.
I don't have much time. I can say briefly that I think I don't really have very much to suggest because I think it's very good. It clarifies how we see Baldwin and what we are trying to use Baldwin for in this present moment and who he actually speaks to as opposed to who the ruling class is telling people he speaks to. And I think it's the perfect setup for the essays that come that actually take those ideas and then develop it much further. It's really strong to me.
The other thing I have to say, I've read it, and I think it's wonderful, as I told you. And I'm so glad you didn't get admitted to graduate school. Seriously, just like I'm so happy that Alex didn't go to medical school. It would have been a waste of your lives. But you finished graduate school before you went to free school. But I think the strength of it is that it treats Baldwin seriously. And he is a serious thinker in so many dimensions. And I appreciate the ideological and moral defense of him. And he has to be defended in this time. So I think it is beautiful. I like the passion. I have to tell you, it read more passionately on the page than you read it.
Oh man, okay, I'll work on
I mean, you may have been a little, but it's filled with a commitment, a passionate commitment, and such ideological clarity.
Can I say one more thing? I like the part where you say that if he did it, it also means we can do it. I think that kind of voice is very important because most people are used to hearing that, oh, yes, there are revolutionaries, but you don't worry about that. Like, you can't really aspire to that standard. But it's important to say what you guys said.
Yeah, I think part of what I think we've been talking about, and what I also wanted to try to do with this, and I think part of what we want to try to do with the issue as a whole, in many different ways, is people will have many different associations for Baldwin. And, part of what we thought was really strong with the last issue was the cover, which was, we had dedicated the last issue to King and the civil rights movement, and Seraphina had done the drawing, the sketch of King, and then Michelle had come up with like the title, like The Hard Price of Courage, or The Hard Kind of Courage, from the Baldwin essay. And it was it's almost like ideologically disarming, I think, in a sense that it's like, yes, obviously you would know King, like many people will know Baldwin, but we want to, in a way that's not like being dogmatic, but we want to try to like flip, I think, certain to catch people a little bit off guard and be like, okay, yeah, like we're doing Baldwin, but like you said, like we're taking Baldwin as seriously as we think this moment in world history needs to be taken. And we're trying to present Baldwin in a way which will almost like, especially with the editorial going at the beginning, to almost like prepare people psychologically almost to like, okay, like I want to know more. I actually want to see, okay, like what is, even if I don't know yet everything, like what is this people's worldview who are putting this issue together, like that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think I was thinking about that a lot in trying to write it, and trying to write it in a way which is not just, obviously we have many like terms and phrases that we use in free school a lot, and we draw from that kind of common like constellation of thought that we've been developing, but to try to write it in a way where it feels like still like fresh and it feels new, or at least it feels like true to what we're trying to accomplish, which is the development of new science, new theory, and all of that. And so, yeah, we're trying to like merge, I guess, part of the poetic with still like the scientific in some way. Yeah, this is something we probably.
Could I suggest one phrase maybe for the end? And this, draws upon King's last speech. We could say Baldwin went to the mountaintop. Now we seek to join him there. In other words, a sense of something is calling us to this moment, and to Baldwin.
Did you want to talk about the articles within it, or move on to the discussion?
We can I can give an overview of the topics of the articles. So Doc is working on an essay about the complementarity of Baldwin and Du Bois's thought. which is something that I think we've been working on, especially since the science conference. And then Jahan is working on an essay on kind of building on also like the DNC like online event. Baldwin as a theorist of crisis, but looking in particular, I think, at on one hand, the crisis of Israel and of Zionism, but how that's intertwined with the crisis of the US state as well, and also the Democratic Party. Nuri is working on an essay about the student encampments and the student movement. And I think drawing from Baldwin and the experiences of like the encampment, but also this, I think, in some ways. And I think making, I don't know if it's like an argument, but on the one hand, just doing an assessment of what actually happened in like this past semester at Penn and by extension other campuses, because there's been a lot of, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of like discourse, a lot of people trying to examine the student encampments, but they do it from a very, what you would call almost like a very leftist worldview, which is very focused on like tactics and like kind of a very almost amoral kind of way of approaching the encampments. And I think it's like for us to try to reassert, no, like this question of morality is a revolutionary one. And it has everything to do with also, yeah, like the university, like the state and all that stuff. Nandita is, I think, almost like building on her previous essay in the past issue, which is about King, and looking at this question of, on the one hand, the Black social system, which she talked about when her and Raji were here in Philly, and then this larger question of modernity and colored modernity. And she's, I think, comparing Francis Fukuyama to thinkers like Baldwin, obviously, but also Tagore and Du Bois. Alice was working on an essay about China and America, and in particular, I think this question of how what's really at stake in terms of how the American people see China is not best framed through all of these kind of like high level geopolitical considerations, but it really is this question of almost Americans' identity and the suffering that we see all around America. And this question of like almost China as a mirror in a Baldwinian sense, or at least that's how I understand it. And then Serafina is working on an essay about Baldwin's last novel, Just Above My Head. And I think both trying to answer the question of like, what is Baldwin leaving us with in that final essay, in that final novel, which is, I think, very widely considered amongst sort of like elite circles as like a really like a part of the quote unquote decline of Baldwin's art, which I think is wrong. And also, I think looking at this question of Baldwin as an artist and how the only way to really be an artist in this time is to be revolutionary. I don't know if that's exactly the best way of framing it, but I think also trying to speak to, yeah, young people who think of themselves as artists in this time and what does that really mean? And Baldwin as a standard for that. And then Emily and Korba are doing a joint essay on one hand addressing the kind of ideological battles involved in and the appropriations of him, especially amongst like the media, like all these podcasts, all that stuff. But then I think more so also examining like almost like pillars of Baldwin's thought, which have not yet been fully defined yet. Like this question of freedom, of like love and identity, and I think there's another one. Like freedom.
And then the conclusion of, the last white.
Yeah, the last white nation in that concept. And then the last piece that we have is an interview with Alfie Pollitt that's being done by Michelle, Kathy, and Doc. And they've already done like 2 rounds of interviews with Alfie, but I think that's really trying to tell the story of R&B and I guess jazz also in Philadelphia, like this untold story of Philadelphia, which is obscured by a lot and obscured by, I think, on the one hand, people not seeing R&B in particular as like almost the futuristic and revolutionary music, whereas it's much easier in some ways to see jazz, like free jazz and all that stuff is like that's the most cutting edge or the most revolutionary. But looking at Alfie, who kind of represents both the unity of R&B and jazz, and something interesting that I think you guys had said was that Alfie feels almost more pressure to perform R&B for Black people than he does performing jazz sometimes, and so yeah, I think that's part of also like our ongoing, like with avant-garde, our ongoing effort to speak to like different kind of social worlds in the city, but including especially like like this question of like music, the jazz world, like the jazz scene or whatever, but to actually try to make a real intervention in that. I don't know if I can give everyone that kind of an overview.
Well, maybe we can move to, unless people want to add about the articles, we can move to the main discussion. Hand over to Doc.
Thank you very much. It seems like we're going back to a topic that is central to our thinking in this period, and that is the white supremacist social system. And as I've thought about our previous discussions, I said, but, oh, wait a minute, I have not defined social system. And all rises in the history, especially of American sociology, and how we are attempting to do something different with it. If you look up, do a Wikipedia, and you put in the word social system or the word social system, what you will get is a very bland definition that goes back to probably the founder of systems analysis in US sociology, a man by the name of Talcott Parsons. And the social system was pretty much looked at as this group of institutions, social networks, social groups, and such that make up overall a system. And the reason that Parsons and others in American sociology wanted to go to a systemic analysis is because they wanted to understand social stability. What are the conditions of stabilizing the society or the social system? And from that kind of systems or structural analysis, you would get specific studies of the church, the labor unions, and so on. But they would all be a part of this whole. But in the systems analysis, especially of Talcott Parsons, well, first of all, the whole social system is held together by a set of commonly held views, a consensus about everything from race to gender to class to democracy. The society would be held together through these common values, common beliefs about these fundamental issues. And so what exists is a constant evolutionary struggle to reaffirm the fundamental values of the American system. You were probably aware of this process in your own lives, even though you never probably thought about it as systems analysis, but that's what it is. There were others who attempted to add an element of conflict, the influence of Marxism on systems analysis, but nothing specifically new, I don't think. There may have been some introduction of hierarchies and inequalities in the social system, especially, I think Merton did that. get his first name off the top. And then more recently, sociologists have talked about a racial social system, but not in the ways that I want to talk about it. But this systems analysis in sociology, to me, is primarily an American innovation in sociology. It is mainstream sociology. It is white sociology. It is definitely, there is no presence of Du Bois or Baldwin or even Marx in a lot of it. However, we want to take the concept social system, first of all, as the overarching glue that holds all of these various parts in the system together. Indeed, Talcott Parsons and others are right that a set of commonly held values and beliefs are necessary. And so the ideological struggle, the narrative hegemony, and now with the internet and other advanced means of communications, almost directly speaking to the individual. Whereas before, Parsons and others would have assumed that, well, the political parties teach the American people about citizenship and democracy. The church teaches everything from gender to race to moral standards. So it's these institutions that give the individual, or show the individual the path to his or her being integrated into the overall system. The assumption also is that integration into the system is necessary, a prerequisite for success. And I know all of you immigrants have heard this over and over again, but you didn't know what you were hearing. It was and so you are assimilated through the values and practices of the system to be a part of a larger social system. Now, what we are talking about is a white supremacist social system, a system that not only and not essentially produces democratic values that will lead to success, but a system that produces and reproduces profound and deep and enduring racial inequality. It is, by its very definition, anti-Black. There are no two ways about it. It produces and must produce whiteness and white supremacy as the overarching ideology. Hence, no matter how you go in postmodern theorizing, agenda theorizing, or new race identity theorizing, it all, in the end, returns to the white supremacist social system. You want to understand the election, you have to understand the systemic framework that is, one, being fought to uphold, to be upheld, and secondly, is a condition for the existence of the two parties and the political system itself. It is not a system, and I think we should get this straight, it's not a system that seeks to emancipate anybody. It is not a system that seeks to expand democracy. And for this reason, our framing of the basic struggle as a democratic, revolutionary, and emancipatory struggle. Now, we can flesh that out and we can give more language. But if this system is the obstacle to democracy and freedom. And the system must be undone for there to be democracy. Then what do we call the struggle going into the Fourth American Revolution? It is democratic, it is revolutionary, and it is emancipatory. Now, very clearly, and this is why I think the editorial statement is very, very good on this point, because it steps to all of the misunderstanding and distractions in theory and thought from the revolutionary process. However you cut it, most of what is called theory, which is bourgeois, which is elitist, which is self-referential, all of it is anti-revolutionary, and a big part of it is openly counter-revolutionary. Now, from the liberal point of view, and here I'm talking about classical Anglo-Saxon liberalism. It is not the modern definition of liberalism that comes out of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, which combines liberal preoccupation with the individual with social reform. That's what, when you see a Bernie Sanders, AOC, when you see all of this, what you're looking at is a modern day form of liberalism. How do you know that? All of them, in the end, reference individual rights. That is not the revolutionary concept of democracy. It is a concept of rights, but not a concept of democracy for this time. And I'd like to underline that. The rule of the people in modern day postmodern liberalism takes a second seat, a back seat to individualism. Okay. This is going to be very important to the way we move forward and think about this when we talk about poverty, especially Black impoverishment. So that's liberalism. Liberal theorizing cannot, has not, and will not resolve any outstanding problem of the white supremacist social system. It is a system that, even if it is reformed, and mainly symbology rather than substance, even if it is reformed, its existence as such undermines lifting the most impoverished, the most oppressed, the most angry, the most disenchanted out of a situation of oppression. Furthermore, bourgeois liberalism, and all of it is, I don't care whether it's Judith Butler or, I don't know, what's it, Bernie Sanders or who, or the Communist Party of the United States. They all end up where they began, in a bourgeois reformist movement. The bourgeoisie had its day. Its day ended. Its day was the 18th century, the period of slavery and colonialism, the center of bourgeois theorizing has always been England. And I would say that the English have not produced great philosophy. However, you don't have to be great to be important in the political arrangement. So the British, whose philosophical contribution is through liberalism, liberal bourgeois theorizing, which centers upon the individual, etc. The whole legal system of the United States, the whole state theory of John Stuart Mill or I forget all the names right now, Burke, or any of them, references law as the means of protecting the individual from the overreach of the state. Hence, to say that the standards of bourgeois democracy should be the standards of Chinese democracy or any other nation's democracy, Cuba, North Korea, is laughable. It's a joke. And it's a joke because the civilizational conditions of bourgeois democracy are unique to the white world. It is not a universal set of standards, is not, cannot be, and should not be taken as such. But it can be the basis, as it is, of cultural imperialism. So you will get, let us take the question of gender and queer movements. If every society doesn't accept America's standards of gay freedom, gay rights, and so on, then you're homophobic, queerphobic, transphobic, etc. So this idea that the only path to democratic development is through bourgeois liberalism is a fraud at best and fake. It is unique to a particular moment in history and to a particular civilization and a particular form of the expression of European or white civilization, and that is the British. The British, for 200 or 300 years, was the most successful European country. Why was it the most successful? Because it was the largest empire, which kind of tells you what the whole thing was about anyway. If you measure success by how many people you oppress and colonize, if that is your measure, if slavery didn't matter because of the protection of law, so to speak, it tells you what it was about all the time. And that's bottom line. Now, from the standpoint of the left, and I would say, and I would encourage anyone to just look at this more deeply. What distinguishes the left from bourgeois liberals? I don't think there's very much. When you get down below the surface of style, maybe the element of, for example, Marxism, even the left's conceptualization of the class conflict is, I think, just an add-on to a generally liberal, reformist set of beliefs. Just an add-on, because the class struggle, as they speak about it, has nothing to do with the United States. You know, it is not the US class struggle. It is not predicated upon the makeup of the US working class, and certainly sees the Black poor as throwaway, and certainly not a class-conscious proletariat. You see what I'm saying? In other words, the left, and I think I'm accurate here. Frankly, I don't think they will ever try to answer or respond to this. The left sees the poor as outside of the working class, which means 20 generations of Black poverty. People say, well, why can't Black people come out of poverty? Well, let me suggest a white supremacist social system. Why are Black people always with these high levels of poverty? Well, we've always been poor. As I've said before, there are families whose impoverishment goes back 20 generations, that's 400 years. There are families that have known nothing but poverty. There are neighborhoods in Philadelphia that only know poverty. How do you explain it? Well, you can explain it by dismissing it. That strategy is the trade union strategy. That's why a guy like Sean Fain is not unconvincing. You know, that's why most of the labor leaders are unconvincing, you know, and bourgeois. Because the burning question for the class, for the working class, is poverty. For the entire working class. And if poverty is the burning issue, then Black poverty must be addressed to address poverty, period. You know, we took a tour. We're going to take more tours. You have to see it. Sometimes I forget that you all have never seen this. Shambarto and Purba always say, you know, we have poverty in India. It's nothing like this. It is nothing, and it is nothing like this because you don't have a white supremacist social system. We have one whose logic produces Black oppression and Black impoverishment over a long historical period. It is almost one of the wonders of the modern world that Black people have risen to achieve what we have. People from around the world will say, well, look, it's not that bad. And if you don't know it, if you haven't seen it, you can live in this country and say, well, it's not that bad. Black people just have to get themselves together. You know what I'm saying? That's the standard belief. And people look from outside. We've had a Black president, but he wasn't Black. You got a Black woman running for president who isn't Black, by the way. And this is progress. You had Martin Luther King, and now the society is adapting to the message of the civil rights movement. Well, this is fake knowledge. This is superficial knowledge. This is an assumption rather than an empirical fact. Because once you look at poverty, you have to ask the question, how is it produced and reproduced over 20 generations? How? No one else has experienced this. To a certain extent, until very recently, most populations in the United States, especially the white population, saw a trajectory of upward mobility called the American dream. Black people never experienced that. How is that so? You see what I'm saying? That question has to be answered. How is it that one group of people never experience what most Americans expect to experience? Most Americans expect that the society will provide them a way to move up, that their children will do better than them, that they will be educated, etc. One group that could never make that assumption. I don't care who you are. People often say, well, what about the Native Americans? No. One group could never expect, and that is African Americans. Because the system of white supremacy in all of its institutions and concatenations and modes of existence can only exist as such to the extent that Black people exist as a quote, defeated and impoverished people, an oppressed nation within a nation. They lie about it all the time, which is deeply infuriating. They have created a Black political class that gives uh, evidence to the lie. In other words, look, we've made it, why haven't y'all? Or look, we've made it, we're going to try to help y'all make it. But nothing ever changes. You know, they've tried just on poverty. You know, I could take you guys around Philadelphia. You say, well, everybody ain't, living in the most broke down house. True that. But even the new little houses that they throw up are so cheap. And it's kind of a move from the high rise projects to these so called individual homes that look something like something in the suburbs, maybe, but everybody knows that these are houses to house the homeless and primarily Black people and to keep them in a state of isolation from society as a whole, which means that their children will go to the worst schools. Once an employer knows the address that you come from, there's certain jobs that you can't get, and on, that the food is the worst and the most expensive. Everything is against this group of people. A white supremacist social system is a hierarchical system based on race. It is not, as Talcott Parsons and others tried to show, it is the system of parts that integrate and uphold a whole system. No, it is a system of hierarchy that continues to reproduce the racial hierarchy, which means Black oppression. Now, the other thing is, where does this system begin? It begins after slavery and the defeat of Reconstruction. It's all over Du Bois, it's all over Baldwin. That the critical moment in holding Black people back from freedom after slavery is the emergence of a white supremacist social system. Now, the white supremacist social system exists, the Black social system exists within the white supremacist social system. It is a system, well, I don't think any other group has had to produce it. It is a system, an alternative, a system in combat, resistance, and conflict with the white supremacist social system. Its language, its music, its art, its intellectuals, its habits, its day-to-day life world. I don't care what metric you use. Black folk are not a part of and have not been assimilated by Black people. I'm talking about 80%. 20% maybe all down, okay. But the overwhelming majority of Black people have not been integrated into the system. Black folk, if you just go below the surface of a conversation a little bit, they will reference slavery. I don't care how, or they will say something that lets you know I'm aware that I'm oppressed. You want to talk to me? Well, let's start here. I'm oppressed, and my people have never been free. That's all over Black people. I don't care who you talk to, especially when you go among the poor. Especially, that is a fundamental assumption that bourgeois democracy, as it is called, never intended to include us. But again, the white supremacist social system replaces the slave system,
Yeah.
where whiteness and blackness take on a deeper significance and meaning. Hence, the famous Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, which might be the most important Supreme Court decision in the history of the country. It legalized a white supremacist social system. It legalized it by asserting and defending the idea that whiteness must be protected by law. Now, this is a change from normal liberalism, of the first American Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, that the individual's rights have to be protected. Here now, a social identity, whiteness, must be protected by the law. And no talk of Black rights can infringe upon this protection. Hence, the appeal of whiteness. The appeal of whiteness, performative whiteness, actual whiteness, however you want to put it, is that to be white is to have your rights protected. The other thing about Plessy v. Ferguson, a lot of people, by the way, say that the Brown decision of 1954 overturned Plessy and the practice of Jim Crow. Well, maybe, maybe not. I would err on the side of maybe not. The legal protections of whiteness, the assumption that whiteness must be protected, is hegemonic in this society. That's the dilemma of Donald Trump. You can't have it both ways. Populism, I'm down. Opposing the deep state, I'm down with that too. But you can't do it as a white man. You got to let something go. To get something, you must relinquish something. Intellectually, he's not at a level to understand any of this. But the Democratic Party, which I feel is the most lethal, the most conscious defender of the white supremacy social system, is the, how would we put it, is probably ideologically and politically the most dangerous political movement, political party in our history and maybe in world history. People say, well, what about the Nazi Party? Frankly, the Nazi Party at best was imitating the American social system of Jim Crow. But the white supremacist social system has not been weakened. It is now more sophisticated and in many ways stronger. You look at the labor unions. Again, the labor unions have abandoned the most dynamic and historically the most significant part of the working class, and that is the Black proletariat. How long can labor leaders continue to say, that's not my concern, I'm only concerned with my membership, while your membership is shrinking in size? This is a betrayal of the working class itself. I just want to say something about the white supremacist socialists. I want to emphasize that it is a system that upholds or is a prerequisite for the functioning of other systems. I don't know how you talk about economics. I hear this guy, Richard Wolff, so-called Marxist, so-called socialist. That's why Marxist and socialist discourse is so unappealing, because it doesn't address burning questions, and it comes off more as liberal reformism than as revolutionary, and it is. But he will talk about the economy, others will talk about the economy. He talks in radical and Marxist terms, but the economy, without reference to a larger system within which it operates, doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. You can talk about economics until you're blue in the face. I don't be blue, but the cows come home. But we've learned nothing. We learned how Wall Street operates, how investment and big corporations perhaps operate. But what about the people? What about the burning issue of poverty? Somehow that is no longer part of Marxist class theorizing. Okay? So the left is equally invested, either through openly stating it or by not even seeing it, to the continued existence of a white supremacist social system. You can talk about economics and Marxist economics and socialism and workers' democracy in the plants, and it becomes insulting. I know I feel insulted by it all the time. The other thing in Marxism is this idea that racism is an ideological derivative or outgrowth of capitalist economic relations. Not so. Not so. So therefore, their argument is you do away with capitalism, you create the conditions to do away with racism. Not so. That is a dishonest argument. And, having been in the Communist Party, that was a major, though unstated, difference. Those who believed in, quote, the class analysis, when it came to race, it was like them attempting to assure Black people, don't worry, when we get socialism, y'all will be free. To which most Black people said, we were told that in 1863. Don't worry, once we do away with slavery, we'll be free. Don't happen like that. And the reason it doesn't happen like that is that no economy exists outside of a larger social system. And in the United States, we're talking about a white supremacist social system, and it must be called what it is. Anything else is a retreat from any possibility of a revolutionary movement forward. The Democratic Party. Now, we're attempting to make a very, very difficult argument, a very unpopular argument, but a true argument. It's the truth. The Democratic Party is the principal party of the white supremacist social system. Okay? Some people say, well, how could you say that? Well, you can say it easily. One, look at the behavior, look at the practice. The behavior and practice, too much denial. When somebody denies over and over, oh, I'm for racial equality. Oh, I'm not a racist. The others are racist, but we're not. Methinks thou dost protest too much. That's just on the surface. If you were for freedom, you wouldn't have to always try to convince me, especially at election time. If you were for freedom, maybe you, using multiple metrics, could show me. Let's go back to 1896. I'm not going to go back to slip. 1896. Show me where your policies have changed and altered the racial relations of this country or have put a dent in the white supremacist social system. Well, that's the low bar. But the high bar is you have to show that your policies, internationally, your policies of empire and imperialism, and domestically, favoring the oligarchs, producing an elite to distort people's understanding of the reality. Show me where your policies have done nothing but upheld the white supremacist social system. Now, the evidence. To begin with, the evidence of such a system is the existence of Black poverty. Black poverty is not like any other poverty in this society. Yes, there are poor white people. Yes, there are poor Latino people. Certainly there are poor Asians. But nobody's poverty is like Black poverty. No poverty, because it is the poverty of an entire group. It is not individual poverty. So you can't change it by me acting differently, by me studying harder in elementary school, by me improving the way I talk, by me doing whatever to change myself. You cannot change Black poverty. You can't change Black poverty by policies of child tax, whatever. You can't change Black poverty by some crumbs off the table temporarily, which are ultimately taken away. You can't change it because it has existed. It is institutionalized. Black poverty is normal. It is normalized. Therefore, when I read an article in the Enquirer or in the New York Times, well, the one in the Enquirer is full of crap. Black poverty went down, or poverty in Philadelphia went down by 1% between 2022 and 23. What am I supposed to do? Backflips? Oh, we're making progress. And yeah, no. This is dilettantism. This is superficial by people who don't give a damn about the poor, and they don't. And all of their statistics and all of their analysis are indifferent to those who live in poverty. And one thing is for certain, you read all of their analysis of poverty, one thing they never want to do is do a historical understanding of poverty. Why is it that this group of people, even in the most liberal articulations of poverty, by liberal I'm talking about who will see it beyond what the Census Bureau says poverty is. Poverty is living in a family of four making $30,000 a year. Well, that's deep poverty, tell you the truth. That there is poverty by living in a family of four making $60,000 a year. When you factor in the price of utilities and insurance and gas and inflation, it just compounds the problem. Any political party, any labor union, any intellectual who does not address the historical character of Black poverty. And I want to emphasize the historic character of Black poverty. It didn't just start. You have to systemically uproot the foundations of Black poverty, which is the white supremacist social system. It is intentional. It is ruthless. Hence, let's talk about, for example, gentrification in the city of Philadelphia. We took our tour and I was showing you all the Italian market where the Italians traditionally have lived and set up businesses and so on and so forth. Well, there's gentrification going on. Soft gentrification, right? Black folk, gentrification, uproot the whole neighborhood and kick everybody out. Temple University, I'm going to show you how they did it. I can show you what existed previously and how those people, the demography, has radically altered. Where did these people go? Hard gentrification. There's nothing soft ever about the treatment of Black people. It's always the hard edge, the most ruthless form. Take policing. Nobody will police like Black people. Nobody. I know we often talk about Black and brown. Yeah, Black and brown, okay. But let's keep it 100. Nobody is policed like Black people. Nobody is treated like Black people. Why? Systemic. The pattern of behavior does not even have to be considered or thought about because it's already built in. It is already built in to its operation. So the agents of it, the employees of it, well, you're going to Harvard, you're going to whatever Ivy League university, and what do you know? You know what the established consensus view is about what? About Black people. You can say, well, it's about democracy. No, it's about Black people. Because how can you have a discussion about democracy that is not a discussion about Black people? That is not a discussion about poverty. Now, I want to just make, and then I'll give this up. The Democratic Party. We have to think and rethink and perfect our language, etc., to identify this behemoth, this monster in our midst. This is going to be a tough one. You see what I'm saying? For obvious reasons, because the propaganda, the narrative hegemony, the symbology, all of that leads most people to believe, and certainly the majority of Black people, although there's skepticism now, to believe that the Democratic Party has inherited the civil rights movement. This is very insulting. That Barack Obama and Kamala Harris, as, and I put quotes, Black folks, know what oppression is, and therefore are the modern day versions of Martin Luther King or Ralph Abernathy or Coretta King or whoever. That the civil rights movement has in the Democratic Party its principal defender. I'm making the opposite argument. That the Democratic Party is not the party of Black freedom. It is the party of the white supremacist social system. It is the vanguard party of that. It is the tip of the spear. It is the most sophisticated ideologically and politically and organizationally in the defense of the white supremacist social system. People say, well, why are all these Black people always voting Democratic? Well, one thing I would say, ain't that many voting Democratic as they once did. there is skepticism. People do not have the opportunity to hear a discussion of this. The range of ideas that can be discussed is more narrow now than I've ever seen it. The control of information, the control of ideas, the control of all of this. This is why when you go among Black impoverished people, you know, you pick up certain legitimate responses. You know, for example, Emily and others went canvassing for a union. And just listening to their stories are very familiar, the attitudes of, well, what you want? You know, first of all, what you want? You think I don't know what's going on? You know, all kinds of layers of skepticism, very different from what you see on these political commercials and what you see Kamala Harris, 17,000 people and yada, 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 yada. But once you get on the ground, and the way I would understand a lot of the behaviors and responses of Black people, do you represent the system? Which is white supremacists. Most Black people know it. Maybe don't have the language. By the way, just a small thing. Baldwin on language and the function of language and how white folk don't have a language to talk about race and poverty. Therefore, they attempt to control every form of discussion and to keep it within the confines of what they know or what their language is capable of expressing. That's why Baldwin with William Buckley is so important to look at and relook at, because he burst the bubble of security, of linguistic and conceptual elitism. He broke it down. I mean, it was a brilliant and courageous demonstration. The Black poor don't want to hear it, no. That is a level of consciousness, a high level of class consciousness, far higher than the Sean Faines of the world, a dilettante and a fraud and a perpetrator. You ain't fighting for no working class dog. You know what I'm saying? You're not fighting for, you're fighting to uphold the white supremacist social system. You would do better abandoning the Democratic Party if you were interested in the class struggle. But you can't do that because your interests parallel the interests of the white elite, which control the major levels of the white supremacist social system. I think certain things at this time are unavoidable. This is one of those truths that is unavoidable. Avoid it, and you say to me that you've adopted the path of immorality and anti-revolution. Increasingly, we're arriving at a point where the moral imperative is the revolutionary imperative. You want to do the right thing. Bernie Sanders, AOC, Sean Fain, the whole slew of others. By the way, they become tropes in the overall narrative. Look, democracy is developing. Look at AOC. Look at Bernie Sanders with his simple self. You know what I'm saying? And he is simple. Look at AOC. Oh, democracy is flourishing in conflict with populism, with authoritarianism. You know what I'm saying? And they just keep saying it. This is not We are not living in a moment of a renaissance of democracy on any measurement scale. We are living in a moment of the opposite, the undoing of democracy, the undoing of the people's institution, and the immiseration and impoverishment of the people, beginning with that group that has fought hardest for democracy against poverty, which are being, we are being attacked on every front. I'll end this little bit. This is going to be a very difficult moment these next 2 months leading up to this election. The population is very tense. The conflicts are very real. Maybe before or after the election, the possibility of violence is very high. Those who participated in or supported the January 6 people or who are in jail, they have not backed up 1 inch. They still feel that the electoral process is against Trump. The political establishment, the ruling class is against Trump. And they are. I'm not talking about this broken cat that can't answer questions and sometimes is so narcissistic and all that type of. I'm talking about whether he knows it or not, he is being used by history. By the way, he's not the man of destiny, but he is being used by history. And he is not afraid to assume that role. But it is just a temporary role. It is to attack the elites. And everybody says it in a lot of these New York Times columns and so on. But this is going to be tense. The American people are heavily armed. The population, especially the white population, will not and does not intend to give up its guns. Not to be used against Black people, by the way. I want to make this point again. I've said it before. The white supremacist social system is now in some ways stronger than it's ever been because of its ideological sophistication. Not because the contradictions within it are not sharp, but ideological hegemony gives the ruling elite an upper hand. But one thing that is not in the discourse is race war. You go back to the 1960s and 70s, it was in one or another way on everybody's tongue. Will there be a race war in the United States? At this point, I don't know who's any of us have ever heard anybody talking about a race war. But what they do talk about is a deepening class conflict. Black folk, less equal, more poor. You see what I'm saying? But then this is manifested in the inequality in general in this society. And therefore, most white working people have abandoned the Democratic Party as a fraud, as a party of elites. Increasingly, Black people are abandoning it. They understand that this is a party of war, that a party of war cannot be a party of democracy or against poverty. So race war ain't on it, but growing political conflict. That's why I just would encourage everybody in the free school, just be safe. Be safe. Be aware. Of course, a place like Philadelphia will not be a site of the most intense and violent conflicts politically. But they keep talking about the suburbs and these small towns and cities. all over Pennsylvania and so on. Butler, Pennsylvania, just to give an example, Allentown. There's no telling what could jump off. After the election, no one can predict how the various sides will respond. We don't know. Certainly, violence and even armed violence cannot be taken off the table. It's there. It will possibly occur. And hence, the three options that we often talk about, civil war, revolution, or the ruin of all classes, remains, these possibilities remain. Revolution is the way forward. The other two delay the ultimate revolutionary struggle. Just the last thing, long interregnum versus a short interregnum. Talking about this from slavery, from Reconstruction's defeat up till today, we're talking about the long interregnum. And the only way to prevent a real onslaught of Black people is that in this long interregnum, we have been assaulted in so many different ways, including cultural, ideological, and so on. I'll stop there.
Well, I think this idea of the white supremacist social system is very clarifying. I was thinking about King and his identification of the triple evils, poverty, war, and racism. And I'm thinking of them as a description of a white supremacist social system.
I agree with that.
And I think
I would say it makes possible I'm sorry, I didn't mean.
No. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they are descriptors, but also I think they are necessary conditions for the white supremacist social system. But I think, they have many functions, so to speak.
I was thinking of those in combination with his call for a revolution of values, a moral revolution.
Yeah.
And that only makes sense to me with the understanding of a white supremacist social system, which reproduces in society certain values, certain principles in people. I think that is a strong hand to counter the claim of the Democratic Party as the inheritor of the Black freedom movement, to say, to present King in combat with the white supremacist social system in this way, and then to contrast that with what the Democratic Party is doing today. You can say there.
Yeah, that's what we always say in the free school, that a fourth American Revolution, King is the father of a new people. Baldwin understands the mechanisms, the workings of the white supremacist social system, especially its ideological, moral, and social psychological dimensions. It can't function without the consent of the quote government. If white people did not accept white supremacy as a permanent and a given, as a protection of their rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the system would collapse because it would have no support. But they haven't, and thus Baldwin.
Honestly, the introduction was really intimidating for me, because I actually think it gets at the heart of why Du Bois came Baldwin, and in some ways it advances what we said in the documentary, which is, what is the unanswered question?
Yeah.
Like, we're getting more specific now, because last week at Free School, you also said something that I think this week explained more, because last week I was trying to process it, where you said Baldwin advances something Du Bois started, which is Baldwin associates whiteness as a racial identity with the state.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that requires us to characterize the white supremacist social system, because basically, like, this thing of the long interregnum, that the white supremacist social system originates with Reconstruction's defeat. Which is why Du Bois becomes so important, because all of Du Bois's work is essentially about why is Reconstruction's defeat so essential to, in some ways, these large human questions of there's no freedom despite emancipation of anyone. But if there's no emancipation of Black people, that's why we have, like, America is the way it is. And so, but this, to me, like, okay, I'm gonna kind of repeat back, but tell me if I'm getting this wrong, which is the white supremacist social system originates with the defeat of Reconstruction, because when you have slavery, like slavery, for example, like legal, that human beings are property, they're human beings who are not human legally because they're legally defined as property. That is one way of, but once you abolish that legal definition, Black people are actually, you now in emancipation, Black people are human beings. The creation of a white supremacist social system where individual rights is not really about individual rights, but instead about the ability to be quote unquote white and able to be successful, necessitates Black people as necessitates Black people to somehow be codified as inferior. And so thus racial identity is it's not about whiteness in terms of like physical or cultural differences, but it's about your relationship to the state. Like whether you are protected by the state or
Yeah,
not.
but it is the physical now being elevated to a legal status.
Right,
This is why you had to have the one drop rule.
right.
Who was white? Before that, all Black people were slaves, or potentially slaves. So you didn't have to, there was a concept of whiteness, but not the one that had, and I agree with you, one that was connected to the state and to the law. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So it does require whiteness. Now, what is whiteness? It is, you can't just say that it's not physical whiteness, because it is. But physical whiteness in its more contemporary postmodern form can also be substituted by cultural civilization whiteness, which also means anti-Blackness. But it's very hard for any Black person to transcend Blackness, because whiteness is such a permanent embeddedness in the culture and the habits of the culture.
Yeah. Well, okay, because I think this all explains, to me, it really clarifies things today where, like, the guy I met playing ping pong, who I hope would come, but he didn't come, he said something interesting where he said, if Kamala Harris was actually Black, then why would she be chosen to run as vice president, to run as president? Because there are actually Black women who could run as president, but they were not chosen for a reason. And what he's saying is that there is such thing as, to be Black means, like, it's this thing of that there is such thing as a whole people, a whole system that necessitates out of the fact that there has to be Black oppression, Black poverty, in order for this whole system, white supremacist social system, to exist, and all of its narratives.
Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose all Black people got some kind of skin lightener,
Right.
and they all look white.
Right.
Would the white supremacist social system be able to exist?
No.
It couldn't.
No.
You need a physically
Yes.
marginalized, physically, quote, different group.
Right.
That can be the target. And
Right.
see, that is an advantage that you have two physically
Yes.
different groups, one from Africa, one from Europe, one physically white, the other physically not white.
Mhm.
You know, we say black or Negro, but, you know, physically not. So that is very important
Yeah.
and to the advantage
Yeah.
of those who wish to defend white supremacy. Because then you could say, well, look,
Mhm.
all of these Africans are slaves because they were, you can use the religious, the biblical thing, the
Right.
sons of Ham, they were condemned from the beginning to be slaves, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
So I just say,
Yeah.
well,
Well,
oh, good, I'm sorry,
no,
forgive me
because,
for
okay, I
interrupting
feel like
you.
I'm talking too much, but I guess my ultimate point is essentially the enemy of democracy, the opposite. Oh, wait. Yeah. Democracy would require you to do something about black poverty.
Absolutely.
Take away the word black. What you just said poverty.
No, you can't.
Yeah, but if hypothetically, if you just said, many people would agree, right? Many people, white people would agree. If there is poverty, then it means we're doing something wrong.
Mhm.
But when it comes to black poverty, white people it is different. It is essentially, to them, they're like, black poverty, they dismiss it. That's something different than poverty.
Well, they would say it's their fault.
Exactly.
See, and this adds insult to injury. You're poor, and then you told it's your fault that you're poor.
Right. Because I've always done the thought experiment. Why is poverty and why is the way people in China view poverty different? Or India, let's say India or China. Lots of poor people.
Yes.
Like lots of actual, but in India or China, fellow Indians and Chinese will feel like it is their responsibility to do something. Because not only is there no physical difference between you and the poor people, but there's also no ideological
That's right.
barrier.
Yeah, this is very important.
Which is why in
And no
America,
institutional, systemic, quote, barrier. In other words, there is no white supremacist or any other supremacist social system in spite of caste.
right.
You understand what I'm saying? It is not a system
Yes.
that reproduces itself or seeks to reproduce
Yeah.
itself, unlike the United States.
And then, but now take the white poor, for example.
Right.
Here's where it fucks up. Here's something that many people would say, oh, poor, oh, it hurts black people. No, but here's how it actually fucks up white people more. That everyone's bound together. Because the white poor, let's say, in like the rural areas of, I don't know, Appalachia or something that people always reference, they actually, it's the same thing. Or to me, it's like this essential thing of, you could say, for example, that this same white supremacist social system, to a certain degree, is infringing upon their individual rights, like in their framework of like being able to
The
white poor, yeah. But they will never see the cause. They will never be able to trace the source of the bad bargain to the white supremacist social system. Because they cannot see, for example, they cannot, the greatest evidence of that bad bargain is black poverty. And because the white poor insist that their poverty is different than black poverty,
Right.
they will never be able to see like that white supremacist social system.
That's true.
And I forget where I was going.
But see, this is where Baldwin is right. And it's important not to misinterpret him when he says, but you're doing more damage to yourself.
Mhm.
Now, I think that's a specific argument with a larger set of arguments. But what you have done to me is unprecedented in human history.
Mhm.
And by you continuing, you're doing damage to yourself. By y'all not attempting to change this. But the assumption that Baldwin proceeds from on all of this is that it is this is historic oppression, you know, and yeah, you have done terrible damage to me and my children. However, we're not alone in this, but we are. And this is the thing of Du Bois, the Black proletariat, and all of this, that we have the capacity to fight and the consciousness to fight. You don't. You have morally debased yourself. You have ideologically debased yourself. That's what he's saying. He's making an argument trying to cut through the liberal assumption.
Yeah. Well, because Baldwin says, he's like, that's why he says that thing where, why is it that when any white people, Polish, Jewish, like Anglo-Saxon, say, give me liberty or give me death, it's people applaud and say yes. But then when it's Black people who say, give me liberty or give me death, it is a fundamental threat to everyone else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And he's pointing to, and he was trying to cut through the racial double standard that white people operate on. I mean, he's trying to cut through a number of things. The bad faith that generally pervades the white community, if you want to call it a community. The bad faith of either saying, I don't know, I'm not responsible for, I didn't get anything from this oppression, etc. All kinds of arguments. And he is saying, I think, that to continue that narrative, to continue that set of assumptions, you become less than. The oppressed are conscious and will fight. But you trying to justify oppression, that's what I think and that's why he is, always so outraged at the set of lies. And he says that white people lie to themselves all the time.
Right.
And then try to maintain or keep up this thing of innocence and all this preoccupation with youth and adolescence and staying young and yada, yada, yada. He says that's a way of negating responsibility. And there is a cultural, civilizational consequence for it. I think that's his argument. But the assumption is this oppression of Black people is unlike anything that has ever happened.
Right.
It's unlike anything, and I'm sorry.
Well, that's why your point that there's no other group who you can't Black for, it's a specific thing, it's a one group thing, because in any other group, let's take Asians, it's an individual. Poverty is an individual condition. It's not a group, it's not a condition of a people. And
you can see a way out of it.
Yes, and there's
even before you can see a way out of it.
Right. And that's why, which is why I feel like in some ways you crystallize the unanswered question, because I think in a lot of ways Baldwin and King, what they were trying to answer is why is it's the Buckley debate question, which is why is it that the American dream is not a universal? Why is the American dream actually not real? Because the American dream is not possible.
It's racially exclusive.
It's racially exclusive. And actually, in some ways, the American dream is predicated upon Black poverty or the oppression of Black people.
Yeah. And see, all of that has produced the consciousness that you see among Black people in a high level of anger, often in a high level of a sense of despair, of depression, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because I was thinking a lot about, I guess my last point is just that I was thinking a lot about the guy who, Serafina and I knocked on his door, and he was like 34, and he had been to prison, he was shot 18 times, and he was like, stop coming to my door and telling me how important it is to vote. Because if you came to my door and told me that you were starting a movement to actually do something about children killing each other, I would put my feet outside my door right now and come out with you. And it's this thing of that you were saying, Doc, which is the Democratic Party, if you were really about freedom, if there actually was freedom that I had to defend, then why are you trying so hard to convince me
Yeah.
of freedom?
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's what he was saying, which is like, if you were actually so about freedom to the point where you're convincing me, why are you not doing anything about these children killing each other?
Absolutely.
And it reminds me how Du Bois said, he was like, you know, everyone has these definitions of democracy, but the way he was like, the definition of democracy to me, Du Bois, is democracy's opportunity. But what he means by that is real opportunity, that there wouldn't be Black poverty, but also where it's like, and in the way he was saying, he was like, the enemy of democracy is war, but not like abstract war, but the war on like, he said it like war on the dark, like the darker worker, which in particular, the first was the slave. But I guess in other ways, I would also say, with the way you said, Doc, that if you were actually about freedom, then show me what you're doing to actually oppose the white supremacist social system. Because the white supremacist social system is the barrier to democracy. And in some ways, you could actually say, despite everything, Trump, when he was in office, the one thing he did that's not just his unpredictability, but the one thing that showed that he did that was against the white supremacist social system, which is why the ruling elite is scared of him, is that war was never guaranteed under him. War was never guaranteed. War can never be controlled.
That's right. Yeah, and it is a positive through indirection. He's not directly opposing it, but you could say objectively, he is opposing it or making the struggle against it more possible by not going headlong into war. I would agree with that argument, but yeah, I could say.
I also thought what you said about the social system undergirds economic system.
I think so.
I think this is really important, and I think an avenue of thought which we're continuing to work out in free school because, for instance, I know you mentioned this before, but part of the reason why I think for like young leftists in the US, for instance, why it's like this whole thing of like Marxism is because you can use it to explain many different phenomena, right? And so even this question of imperialism is framed, like Lenin's whole famous formulation of like imperialism is a stage of capitalism, an outgrowth of capitalism, all that stuff, which I think is very compelling and interesting and like has many important like theoretical and historical formulations. But I think part of what, well, I guess to start, part of what we're trying to do is to also explain, like, okay, like let's take the genocide in Gaza. You can't, when you just kind of hand wave and say it's imperialism, and like I also know that whether it's like Richard Wolff or people like Michael Hudson, they'll be like, oh, what's really at stake is like geopolitical economic interests. And like that's not to say that there aren't geopolitical economic interests involved in the whole like this conflagration in like West Asia and the Middle East, but that alone does not really explain the ferocity and the depravity of particularly like the Israeli regime and of the United States government and fueling that towards the Palestinians. And for that, you need to make sense of something that is like almost it's not superstructure, but it's actually part of what constitutes that system. And I think the other thing too that is very interesting is you could almost say that, I feel like the other claim that, let's say like this sort of maybe the hypothetical Marxists who like one would debate with is and also I think actually Trump people would say this too. It'd be like, by talking about white supremacy, you're dividing people where they don't need to be divided. I think this is a claim that's made very often. Tucker Carlson will make it, many Marxists will say it, so on and so forth. when you actually get underneath it, though, like obviously there's many reasons why people will say that, which have to do with kind of how they're framed ideologically within this overarching system that we've been talking about. But it's that, for instance, there's no way actually to explain, in particular, the opioid crisis and the drug crisis without first looking at what the ruling class did to the Black community, which then spread to the wider white community. But like, I think that's also part of the formulation of how you have to actually say concretely, this social system, even though it promises something to white people, like in the end, all like wider groups of society are affected by what the ruling class first does to Black people and does in the most ferocious way to Black people. But it spreads out to the rest of society. And also that I think part of what I've been trying to make sense of for the past couple of weeks and months is why, almost also, why after 8 years does it feel like the Trump movement hasn't moved anywhere? Or I don't know, sometimes I feel like I go back and forth between thinking maybe it has moved somewhere, but sometimes I think it hasn't. It's like, okay, like it's been 8 years, what have you accomplished? And this is not to be like antagonistic or be like the anti-Trump thing, but it's, I think part of it has to be, if you get underneath it, part of it has to be explained both in terms of, if you say the Trump movement started primarily amongst, like, let's say, like kind of downwardly mobile white people in this country, and then also has spread to different parts, like racial groups, all that stuff. But if you start there, I think part of what maybe this is a hypothesis, but part of the reason why the Trump movement hasn't been able to achieve that much over the past 8 years is not just the attacks from the deep state, although that's a major part of it, but it's that in the conditioning of the social system, there's not much that prepared the Trump movement to actually struggle, to wage that struggle. And that, like that kind of social conditioning for struggle, which is so palpable and is so strong in the Black community, that was never really part of the social makeup of, let's say, like the kind of like our kind of archetypal idea of like who a Trump supporter might be, especially in terms of like the core base. And like the church doesn't function in the same way, even though obviously they do have churches. And the social, like the kind of overall social system was not, it didn't prepare, I think Trump people in particular, to actually wage that struggle in the way that it needed to. And I think, but the problem is that the Trump movement, like this is me speaking in generalities, they're not really aware of that. They're not aware of even like that being an deficiency.
Or maybe they're in denial.
And they're in denial. And I think the other kind of branch is that, you know, similar to like this whole thing about like the drug crisis first targeting the Black community and spreading to, let's say, like white suburban communities, for example. Part of what I think has fucked the Trump movement up is that for a brief moment in time, because of their stance against the state and against the ruling elite, people in the Trump movement started to feel almost that they were being treated in the way that Black people are treated in society. But this is like, it's psychologically very confusing to them. Because on the one hand, you have people like, because I follow a lot of like kind of the ideologues in the Trump movement, like Tucker, other people, and they'll say actually white people are the most oppressed in American society. But this is like them reacting to a kind of very basic thing of, yes, like Trump people were demonized and are demonized. And but it's like the source of that demonization by the media is basically to like almost in a very subtle way, or maybe not so subtle way, to be like, oh, Trump people are like these unwashed, they're crude, they're backwards. But all of those associations is almost to make the Trump people look like Black people almost. Not exactly, but close enough. And that this is part of what I think has messed up and I'm just using the Trump movement as a kind of larger case to make a larger case of like how we actually understand this and why we're making this argument. But that, like, in order for, and I don't know if the Trump movement can really be saved at this point, regardless of what happens in the election, but in order for that particular movement to even make any kind of headway, even on its own terms of like, we don't want World War III, we want to reindustrialize America, you would have to, like you said, give up something in order to actually achieve something.
Yep.
And I think it's like the question is, are people willing to pay that price? And we don't know. Like that's part of the unknown quality of it. But I think this, like to go back to what I said at the beginning, this question of a social system and how it conditions the economic system, I think is really important. And I'm really excited to like keep developing that question, because the other thing, last thing I'll say is, this is also partially a question, but because the American situation is so unique, and like obviously their like race was used in like, let's say, like different ways in like Brazil, for instance, but the American situation is so unique that we can't really say in the same way that a Marxist would that the class struggle is universal throughout human history. We are in particular talking about an American social system which was invented first with the slave system in the United States and then further developed with the defeat of Reconstruction. So in that sense, we can't really say like, oh, this is a universal thing which is applied throughout human history. However, what is important today is that because the American system functions not just domestically, but also functions as an empire, the resolution of the contradictions of our social system do have implications for the rest of it.
Absolutely.
And you can also see in the way that, like we brought this up last week, but like where did the Israelis get this whole thing of like, we need to exterminate the Palestinians from? You get it from the white supremacist social system in the United States. And that like, these are very concrete examples I think we have to actually be very clear about as an explanatory framework. But yeah, I don't know, because I feel like we've been like working around this question of, like quote unquote universal theory versus particular theory. But I do think that our primary task is to work out this like a new revolution, or like a more complete revolutionary theory that draws from people like Du Bois and King and Baldwin, that particularly applies to the United States, but obviously also has implications for the rest.
Well, I was also thinking about, this is something that we discussed a few weeks back, maybe, but how you talk about race has to change in this moment, where I think the way, and the ruling elite also talks about race a lot, and they talk about black-white relations a lot, but it's always from the perspective of prejudice, from a cultural perspective or an identity perspective. But what we are talking about, like the need for talking about it in systemic terms, becomes important to clarify precisely some of these contradictions, even with the Democratic Party. Because I think if you looked at the Black freedom movement, and the reason why it was the Third American Revolution was like Reconstruction, what it was trying to do, what it was in opposition to, was actually the state-sanctioned oppression of Black folk through a social system, a white supremacist social system, which was the basis for the solidarity of the Black freedom struggle with the world anti-colonial movements, with the world peace movement, because white supremacy as a world system of oppression was something that broad humanity was dealing with. But the Black freedom struggle here in this country was a concentrated form of that same struggle. But it was not just to remove racial prejudice or how white people saw Black people, but it was actually, against that social system. And the point I'm trying to make here is that this is how you can explain the extension of the struggle for Black freedom to a broader peace movement, to an anti-colonial, universal anti-colonial struggle.
And to you,
Yeah,
how you saw Gandhi and the independence movement of India
Right.
through the Black freedom struggle.
right,
Can you
right.
say something more about that? I find it-
Well, I mean, because growing up in India at a time which was 2 generations, 3 generations removed from the freedom struggle, Gandhi or Nehru or freedom struggle is only presented to you as a thing of the past that you benefited from. But we are at a different stage now. We're looking at different problems. But it's hard to really get a sense of what Gandhi represented in the moment, how ahead of his times he was, and more importantly, how connected he was to this global struggle against the same enemy, which was this white supremacist order. But King clarifies that for me, because you see it in you see that close collision between the Black freedom struggle and this white supremacist social system here. And then it gives me context for how to see Gandhi in a time that I haven't, I didn't live through. But I think this is how I'm also thinking about what you said about race war not being something on the table right now. I think this is related to the conception of how we talk about race or what we see the color line to represent. When Du Bois said that this is the color line is the, the problem of the 20th century, he wasn't talking about prejudice or, like white people just being prejudiced against black people. He was talking about this social system that exists to make sure that white supremacy is the order that controls the entire world. And I think this is a framework that we need to develop and make really concrete, because it explains more of what's going on, not just in this country, but even with Palestine, everything in the world. It explains what's going on in the world better than any theory that has been handed down can. And I feel like one of the biggest evidence of the Democratic Party being the vanguard party that protects the white supremacist social system is because they talk about race, but they talk about it from the perspective of, identity. Trump is racist. This is a bigger difference. Yeah.
I agree. They talk about it in order to obscure it.
In order to obscure
To
it,
give you a
exactly.
sense that what we're talking about and we're aware of it, but actually it is to obscure
Right.
the systemic nature.
Right. And in fact, their formulation of race is suited to a time that's before the Third American Revolution, And the fact that they bring it back up means that, just what you're saying, they're trying to obscure, because certain gains were made by the Third American Revolution, I think certain legal sanctions to racism, certain prejudicial sanctions to racism, there were gains that were made by the Black freedom struggle in a certain transformation about how Americans think of themselves and their identity and race relations. But the reason why the Democratic Party has to go back to that conception of race instead of what we are talking about, the systemic perpetuation of poverty over 20 generations.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing race like that, if the Democratic Party wants to talk about, oh, Trump is fascist, bigot, racist, but there is no real threat of race war, it exposes their purpose to be one of obscuring, where the revolutionary task lies. But yeah, those are some of the things that I was thinking about. Because the idea of a race war not being on the table does not exclude the very real consequences of black poverty and black suffering.
Yes.
Like when you say there is no race war on the table, that should not immediately imply that things have become better. There is that essential problem to still confront with, which was being confronted by the Third American Revolution and requires a Fourth American Revolution to fulfill it. But anyway, yeah.
Well, I mean, I agree with what you were saying about, the Democratic Party being the vanguard of white supremacy at this time. I was thinking also of, like how even like such words as progressive are used. And maybe this, this is a time where it's becoming very clear that the idea of the idea of what they think of as progressive is essentially to adjust to white supremacy in a way that is compatible with maintaining it as a world system today. And like in some ways I think the what we call the far right, for instance, its idea of white supremacy is it is a more primitive version of that. Like the way they think, like the way the Democratic Party would talk about like even Trump as an individual and a racist and so on individual. This idea rests on the fact that like what you guys were just talking about the form of white of racism. They're talking about race in a way that may have been appropriate like 70 years back, but definitely isn't now, in the sense that it doesn't take you to be like physically white in order to be accommodated into the white supremacist social system. And I was thinking I was listening to like recently Chris Smalls, who was he organized with the Amazon Labor Union, and he was recently interviewed by Brianna Joy Gray, and he was like it was refreshing to listen to him because he was talking about how like he's obviously he's very young, he's not experienced, he hasn't had a lifetime of experience with the union movement and so on, but basically he was calling out the fact that like the labor movement as a whole increasingly has become more responsible to the elected officials, to the union leaders rather than to the working class. And he was talking about how like being involved with the labor movement to some degree makes it clear that there are lots of white supremacist elements even in the left. And it was, I mean, it was confirming to like it was a confirmation of how like we have been talking about, like we talk about the left in this country as a product of as a product of also, like if not a product, at least a manifestation of the white supremacy social system, where it it talks about like even its idea what you were saying about the class struggle. It's essentially a way to fit the language of the class struggle into the white supremacist state.
Assumption, yeah. I'm
The,
sorry.
yeah. But I say that to say that I thought it was very clarifying what you were saying about the particularities of the assumptions on which the state was like the white supremacist state was built, because this the idea of the state as a defense of individual rights, and of like basically the liberal state that comes from Europe at a particular time. And I was thinking, and this please correct me if I'm wrong because I'm thinking out loud, but I think uh to go back as far back as the 1700s, the way like the place where in some ways the chronology of the left starts. It starts from the French Revolution almost, and to talk about like the French Revolution ultimately was it it produced a it produced a class, it produced a bourgeoisie who had power, and then the idea of the state that came about was the state was uh, like it was the mechanism to further the existence of that protected class. It was a class that already came into existence through the revolution, through the French Revolution, and so the idea of the state had to be accommodated to the values or the formulation that sustained that class, which was of an individual liberty and so on. And I think this is in fundamental opposition to how how revolutionary democracy was conceived of in during Reconstruction, where it was not the defense, or it was not the perpetuation of a class, of an economic class, which because there was no class, because of the one drop rule and so on. So there was no conception of a class, I believe, at that point, in the formerly enslaved. and and therefore the idea of the state, or the idea of democracy as we talk about, or as Du Bois talks about it, it's in fundamental opposition, because it's trying, like, its conception of the state is actually a rule of the people, but it's not the rule of, or the perpetuation of a class. And I think that if this distinction, I mean, if this is right, first of all, if it's right, then if you don't see this distinction, then uh, it's impossible to see what we've been talking about, that political economy does not account, or it's like, as was saying, it's undergirded by the social system. So the social system is firstly the question of
Can I
go, no, no, go ahead.
no. I just, in the thing, and I know Jerry talks about this, so much goes unanswered.
Mhm,
You
mhm, mhm.
talk about, so much goes unanswered with the economic or mode of production
Right.
theory. You left, go ahead, I'm sorry, I just
No, no,
wanted
no,
to say
no.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that, because this is it may have, I mean, I don't know, but it may have been like, the irredeemable blind spot of Euro, which may have been a part of,
Yeah.
like, even of Marx. Sure. I mean,
No, and that's the civilizational disposition. The
Right.
civilizationally, even the greatest of European thinkers are predisposed to see the world through their own reference, through their own eyes, and not to say more than that. But I agree with you. That is so much a part of Anglo-Saxon liberalism, that it is the individual that must be protected, and so on. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's civilizational, among other things. You know,
Right.
the
Right.
fact of civilization.
Wait, can I add to what
Go
Shambhav
ahead.
is saying?
Go ahead.
Where I feel like this a little digression, but it ties to this is I think we've also been thinking about this idea of what does the state represent,
Yeah.
and the difference between a state that exists to perpetuate the agenda of a particular class versus the state of the whole people, which is something that we've discovered. And one of the reasons that we've been thinking about it in recent times is because in the India reading group, we've been reading Didi Kosambi, who's talking about ancient Indian history to try and understand, in some ways, the genesis of the Indian state or an Indian social system. And he makes the claim, and this is in the 4th century BC, like this is an ancient state. So we're not talking about a state in the same way as, after the Industrial Revolution or, but he claims that the first conception of the Indian state was closer to the idea of a state of the whole people, because there wasn't the existence of a class, of a powerful class for whom the state, like whose interests the state had to represent. It had more to do with the fact that most of the land in India was covered in jungles, which had to be cleared, and the land had to be brought into cultivation to feed the people who were moving from a pastoral lifestyle to a more agrarian lifestyle, settled, community. So from tribe to society. And there's a lot there that we haven't fully figured out yet, and we're still in the process of. But the thing that it establishes is, unlike what Eurocentrist theory suggests, there has always been that civilizational alternative to the formation of a state, which was not overdetermined by a dominant class existing, right? And I think in some ways, when Shambartu was talking, it also reminded me of how Baldwin always makes. And I think what he's trying to say is, in the formulation of the American state, there was an opportunity to break from the European notion of the state as an instrument of a certain economical political class, which could not ever be fully, like couldn't ever be fully democratic in America, because slavery was, in some ways, there was an attempt to make slavery compatible with the state. So it could never be a state of the whole people. And I think it says something, I think it explains why a white supremacist social system was necessary, because the state represented the interests of a ruling elite that pinned their interests with the interests of white civilization. And they had to deal with the presence of first the enslaved proletariat, but then the freedmen, like the freed slave. They had to account for that through a white supremacist social system that carried out, the agenda or the interests with which the state was established. And yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot there to explore, this idea of a state of the whole people versus what the American state represents today. And I don't know. Again, I think if we revisit the Black Freedom Movement, or the aims or the vision of the Black Freedom Movement for a new America, from the perspective of the social contract between the state and society, which is something that we were also discussing last week, Baldwin's formulation of the relationship between the social system, the individual within the social system, and the state's mediation. I think it clarifies a lot that Marxist theory, Marxist-Leninist theory, political economy, all of them fall short, because there's a dimension here. and that is universal, because you can then start talking about the Chinese state, you can start talking about the Indian state, and try and compare, what were the historic forces that led to anyway.
May I add one thing to, I thought, related to what you were saying. I think like what you were saying about this distinction between the white supremacist social system and the slave system. I thought it was important because in some ways, this idea that like racism is like it cannot be explained away by like just a stage of or a manifestation of capitalism, because I think this is related to the question of chronology and how even Reconstruction and Jim Crow um, how the narrative of Reconstruction and Jim Crow is being pushed by the narrative of the Democratic Party and so on, because in some ways it's trying to, I think the idea basically says that of course you can talk about the transatlantic slave trade as a product of this time where on the right before the Industrial Revolution, where in Europe is an empire and so on, and it has discovered this land to be cultivated, all of that. But then, like Jim Crow, I think what we are seeing is a Jim Crow and the white supremacist social system. It comes, as Du Bois says, as a counter-revolution to the democratic process in the South, in like during Reconstruction. But I think it's actually very insidious that the way the Democratic Party and all of these museums they want to talk about it is almost that the fight against, or the Black Freedom movement of the last century, that was a continuation of simply the fight against Jim Crow, as the Jim Crow was a natural manifestation that came out of the capitalist development in America. But essentially what it tries to do is it's trying to basically erase the fact that there was a fundamental democratic movement of a new type of democracy in the South, and Jim Crow was a response to that, and not the other way around. And I think that if this distinction is not made, then it's very easy to say that of course like Jim Crow was the natural continuation of the transatlantic slave trade, and therefore the Black Freedom movement was essentially like to oppose Jim Crow, and of course like we're all done with it. So with the last century and after King, and you had the Jesse Jacksons, and then you had Obamas and the Harris. So now, of course, it's very easy to make the claim that the fight against which the Black Freedom movement is essentially won. So poverty never enters.
That's the assumption.
Yeah. This one, yeah.
It's
Oh, well, in a way, I'm glad that Purva brought up our India reading group reading, because I was also thinking about that in the context of this conversation, where we were reading about ancient India and about how the first state was created, like the ruling class was created in the service of the state and not the other way around. And I guess in thinking about that and this, I was thinking about a question which I've been like trying for the last hour to formulate properly, which is when you said that the white supremacist social system developed after Reconstruction, was the white supremacist social system created because slavery and racial inequality had to be perpetuated in a more sophisticated way? Or did the failure of Reconstruction result in the creation of a class that led to the creation or the establishment of a white supremacist social system naturally? So, I don't know if I'm making it quite clear. What led to the other?
chicken or the egg argument, a question. It's if I could just say, one can argue that something of a white supremacist social system emerges with enslavement and the slave system, the plantation slavery system, and the development of a proletariat, which was super exploited and so on and so forth. But then you see, you could deal with the origins and you could deal with the dialectics of its evolution, where the social system comes, and even under slavery, the social system does not appear at the same time that slavery appears. There's a period of the development of a social system. And, you know, when did the form of the social system under slavery exist? But I think that we're looking at something very modern, very contemporary in this white supremacist social system that, as some have pointed out, as Sambarta pointed out, has even been adopted by the Israeli regime, by the South African regime. But the distinction is, no matter what they take from it, and the Nazis and the apartheid South Africans did, there was never the development of the sophisticated system of laws, of propaganda, of ideology, you know? And so, yes, I think that, yes, slavery, you could say 1619, the evolution of the slave system, the plantation system under British colonialism, and then the anti-colonial struggle, but the system of slavery continues. But then, once you get to the American Revolution and laws and
Is Henry.
It's in.
The state, this is where you put, the development of an independent American state, and thus defined by laws and a constitution, which out of the gate define the African as 3/5 of a human being. And then it would go on about almost 60 years later and declare that a black man had no rights, that a white man needed to respect, and yada, 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 yada. But as this was happening, a social system, this is why Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro is very important, and why this very area that we're sitting in is so very important, because this is where the elements of the American social system are taking form. But then it's two social systems, because you have Mother Bethel and this church, which increasingly are not a part of the white system. Now, is it a white supremacist social system at that point? Maybe, maybe not. But what is abundantly clear is what comes in the counter-revolution against Reconstruction is what we can legitimately call a white supremacist social system. And certainly, to explain everything that we see and experience at this very moment must be explained by something more than political economy, something more than a theory of the class struggle. It can only be explained, unanswered questions can only be answered if you broaden the lens of explanation and observation and say that there is a social system, and a social system is the totality of all that goes into producing a society and holding it together, including ideology. And this is, I'm going to shut my mouth here. This is why, to argue, as they would call it, a materialist analysis and therefore laws and habits and culture are derivative. That does not work, because then you get into a default that to understand culture, you have to default to the economy. You understand what I'm saying? But what we're talking about is that law, the state, and all of that are accounted for by a white supremacist system that does what? Produces and reproduces white supremacy. This is why the question of poverty can be explained in this way. That's why I was trying to hit on this. The normalization of Black poverty is something that has to be understood, not in itself, but in relationship to a social system. And this is where, and yeah, I'm sorry, forgive me for talking to
No,
you.
that helped understand, because I was just trying. I was basically trying to understand, the conditions that led to the formation of the white supremacist.
The defeat of Reconstruction.
Right.
And what do we do with this vast proletariat who, and Du Bois is right about this, were active participants in the defeating the slave system. 160, 180,000 of them in the war. But then the general strike, the possibility of the dictatorship of the Black proletariat, all of this, the Second Civil War in South Carolina. That's why you get all these Black people in Philly from South. They're fleeing because it was a rumble, and then the Ku Klux Klan won. But I'm sorry.
So you would say that the elements that were involved in the counter-revolution against Reconstruction was the inception of the white supremacist social system.
I'm not saying it like that. I'm saying that what is the system that comes after enslavement?
Okay.
Yeah.
And well, no one could have predicted a white. Now we see it. But what do you do when 10 million people, 4 million slaves, 5 million white people live in a part of the country where the state is collapsed? What do you do? You see what I'm saying? And so societies must be rebuilt, and that's what, how does it eventuate? Well, you get Plessy v. Ferguson. That to me is the decisive moment, because of this huge role of law in setting the terms of rules of the way society and the way the state operates. And so that moment where whiteness becomes a legally protected
Category.
When you think about it, in the long history of like Kosambi's study of the early Indian state, and on, I guess, his studies of the early Chinese state, these states from nomadism and pastoralism to settled agriculture and so on and so forth. Okay, but nothing of this magnitude has ever occurred where you take a physical characteristic, which in a lot of ways became an identity in its early form, and elevate it to a socially and legally protected category just because you look a certain way. And hold on a minute. And everybody that don't look that way, in particular Black people, no other group. This is why when people say, what about the Native? It don't apply. It does not apply. Now, we can bring it in, but to use it in a way to say, well, we were all, no. The category of whiteness is developed as a legally protected category against Black people. Ain't nobody, well, maybe they're residuals to everybody, but it's against Black people. And a system then, with those legal parameters, is developed protect whiteness, which means that everybody that could be white or identify as white would do so because I'm protected. The American dream, all of that. But then, what about Black people? What is the price that we have paid? It's enormous. It is enormous. And I don't go, I'm sorry, Sean, too.
We can let Joe go.
Wait,
then
can I insert
yeah.
something?
Okay.
And also, well, one thing is it accurate to say that the reason why Reconstruction also is so significant as the beginning of the white supremacist social system today?
The defeat of Reconstruction.
The defeat of Reconstruction is because, like, slavery was in the South, so technically the North, like.
This is very important.
Because
This is very,
Du Bois,
I'm sorry.
yeah, because in some ways
Very important.
Du Bois says there is a moment in time with Reconstruction
Mhm.
where you could actually have a United States under a different kind of state. And instead, what happened was the counter-revolution of property. Instead, what you have is, for the first time, a United States under the same white supremacist social system.
That's right.
Because
that's
before,
Very
before you had two different economics. One dependent on legal slavery, like human beings considered legally defined as property, and then the North had its own economic system, which is what the Civil War was about incompatible economic systems. And so with the defeat of Reconstruction, what you have now, the beginning is you have a united economic system that now is dependent on a different kind. Now depends on Black oppression that then is legally defined based upon legally protected whiteness.
This is interesting. May I just
Yeah.
I mean, because what you're putting it beautifully, because what you have then is the construction of a single social system, which is predicated upon the protection of whiteness. And, it's hard to know we would take an army of historians of good intention to work out the details of this. But now from two social systems to one social system based upon the protection of whiteness.
And then one something for me is, I also think that's why, in some ways, the unresolved question at this point can only be answered in the North. Okay, this is my hypothesis, but because back in Reconstruction time, I guess, with the Great Migration, to a certain extent, people believed that you could escape the South, like hardcore oppression, like death, by going south, but going north. But then over time, in fact, it's the whole United States. There's no such thing as escape.
There was no escape.
There's no escape.
No escape.
And in
That's
fact, the North is the most exemplary of the fact that there's no escape unless you transform the whole society, unless you defeat the white supremacist social system. The only escape is the transformation of society, which is why I think Baldwin in some ways is so significant, because he comes out of Harlem. And then, I don't know, because like Turba had brought up Take This Hammer, that film about San Francisco. And the whole point of Take This Hammer is that, like, here you have the Black proletariat, the Black poor in the North, who are in fact not any different from the Black proletariat or the Black poor in the South.
It's worse in the North.
Yeah, and that's worse in the North. And that's also why King said we have to go north now to Chicago.
That's right.
And that's why the formation of the Poor People's Campaign. This is not the Montgomery bus boycotts anymore. This is not about the legally protected right to vote anymore in the South, which is denied. What we're encountering now is a campaign, like a Poor People's Campaign. It's like a higher stage of struggle.
Absolutely.
A higher state of struggle, which requires you to identify and defeat the white supremacist social system, which unites Black people. It unites Black people with the American people.
Just be a little careful on that. But I hear what you said. It should be a single struggle. And what we hope for is that it might become that. But we do not know the capacity of white people to fight consistently. One thing we know, they're not at the level of Black folk. No way, shape, or form. But anyway, go ahead, Nuri.
Well, I feel like it's important or deep to think about the social system as basically like emerging, like emergent, and then also developing. And I think the transition from like slavery to like legally defining a class or like a status, and that being like the distinction towards whiteness becoming a protected category is a very interesting transition, because it's like then in the time of like the slave system, just defining slavery alone was enough. But then, yeah, then transitioning towards whiteness as being the protected category
Yeah, the
becomes
United
necessary,
States,
because
yes.
technically then Black people are citizens of the United States. And so they should be part of like the state or like part of the protected class. And so there has to be a new, I guess, decision or cutoff point. And I also think that placing it at the time of Reconstruction, the defeat of Reconstruction, is especially significant because of basically the possibility of the dictatorship of the Black proletariat in South Carolina, where actually the Black social system, or like the emergent Black social system, could have actually taken power of the state, and then thus grown to define like even a state of the whole people, which I think Du Bois outlines with like universal education, like universal healthcare, whatever. Where that's a different vision of society, and so it has to be taken over by basically a white supremacist social system. And I think, yeah, basically like this thing of whiteness becoming a protected category is really interesting. And also because I think I was thinking about China and like this idea of the state of the whole people from what you're saying, Torba. And a state of the whole people is fundamentally impossible in a white supremacist social system, because it like by definition has to exclude entire groups of people from like actual democratic representation or democratic participation in the state. And I also think this thing of like liberalism that you're saying, Doc, like liberalism being focused on the rights of the individual, and that being pervasively like, I guess, coming out of like Europe, like Anglo-Saxon like philosophy, and like that conception of the state, and how it has sort of transferred itself to the US into like Bernie, like Kamala, like AOC, and even Marxists is pretty important, because I was thinking about when Du Bois said, yeah, the problem of the 20th century is the color line. That implies like a systematic problem that needs to be broken, because individuals can cross the colors. And I feel like the whole premise of the Democratic Party at this point is to take exceptions. For instance, the 1% decrease in Black poverty, and to cast those exceptions as actually like the rule. And I feel like the whole point of that is basically like an epistemological like sleight of hand, almost, to say like, oh, there's no system at play. Actually, there's just a group of individuals. And that itself is justification for the perpetuation of the white supremacist social system. Because, for instance, when you said that Black poverty is unlike all other forms of poverty, I feel like there's a way that you can look at it if you're like a white supremacist and say like, oh, actually, no, the fault is in all the individuals who are Black. Whereas what we're saying is, no, the fault is in the system. The fault, like you cannot blame Black people as individuals for their problems. Like there is a systematic element at play. And basically, I think the way that individuals are used, either, I guess, as exceptions to the rule, or like in economic, I guess, determinism or materialism, is almost to say that all classes or groups of people move. I feel like both of those are basically like stiff ways of conceptualizing actually like the movement of forces, or like the systematic development of things. Because if you just look at individuals, it's very easy to leave the overall system intact, or to just like dismiss it as a fact. And I think even the question of the state, where it, by definition, I feel like the state is the collection of individuals, but it represents and has a power greater than just the collective pooling of individuals. Like it has a power that goes beyond that. But then, I don't know, there's this way that the state is able to use individuals while cutting them out of all the benefits that the state should, I guess, provide. This is kind of messy, but overall, like, I think that Baldwin, or even Du Bois, like this idea of law and chance, or the way that Baldwin looks at individuals as a part of the social system, not as exceptions to it, or basically like dismissing or disproving this idea of a system, but even I think the Du Bois and Baldwin way of almost using like archetypes or people who are representatives of something larger, is pretty deep, where people can, in some ways, yes, like in some ways be different, like they can be distinct from like an overall group. Like it's not a stereotype or to say that all people are the same. But I think there's something in the, I guess, the frame or the level of analysis of actually using the individual heart or like the individual like inner world of a person to speak for or to be a part of a larger group, and almost to like be the solution as opposed to like the exception, or like something that I think is kind of interesting.
Adding, seeing what you just described right here of the white supremacist social system emerging out of the defeated Reconstruction, most viciously in the South, where you had to deal with this new problem of the freed man who you didn't ultimately want to truly be freed because the United States system was depending on it. I get a clear sense of why it was so important for the civil rights movement to tack on what you would call segregation, which was really, you had a whole world within a world, which was the Black world, and external to it, with a hard line in the sand of segregation, the white world, which is seeking to collapse onto it, the Black world, oppress the Black world. You needed a way to deal with that, to tackle the white social system, and the physical separation was, which was supposed to be a kind of oppression, external and separate, was a way to challenge that, which through the evolution of the civil rights movement, made new possibilities for a people that could deal with the oppression, which was not purely economic, but certainly economic. And that really gives me a makes it very clear why there's a different logic to the American revolutionary process than just class struggle and class oppression. And really in, challenging the either consciously or unconsciously the white supremacist social system through the civil rights movement, as it went to the north, for example, in taking on things like war and poverty. It was, how do you put it, something more broad, deep, and sophisticated in its presentation, but in challenging it by removing like the physical separation, I would have expected to see and this was something that was always in the back of my mind, of the possibilities at this time, where the white social system, or the way that white society was constituted, would be, in a certain sense, reorganized towards these common goals that unite us, like opposing war and opposing economic oppression, but also just redirected. And at least through what we've seen in the Trump movement, the way the white social system is organized on like the human to human level is very unsophisticated, almost not very organized at all. It seems to me more that it is a function of the state, and as we've discussed, the function of the state and the complicit giving up of your responsibility and your participation directly towards this authority, which makes it, I guess, extremely undemocratic, to say that the democratic capacity of the American people within the white social system is severely diminished and stunted, which puts greater emphasis on, I guess, what I have a sense of what currently exists in the Black social system. And yeah, I guess it's still an open question on how to bring in broader sections of the American society to a way of life that is meant to not just survive but overcome oppression.
But since, oh, I'm sorry. No. I think Joe, you want to say something?
Yeah. I look at things a little bit in reverse to it. You look at it. I think it's probably because I come out of a different part of academia, which focuses on economics, finance, and I see slavery when the mercantilist system. And to me, I could not be. I mean, one of the things I went to school for economics and finance because I wanted to understand the economic system that created the political system. I never saw the political system creating the economic system. I always saw just the opposite. Because I lived in a situation where economic resources were not accessible, were not available. So I looked at it, you have to, what caused it? And slavery would have never existed if there hadn't been a new world. What brought about the new world was, what brought about slavery was the new world. If there was no new worlds discovered, slavery would have never came into being. It came into being because I look, as to talk to some of my buddies, I sit down and imagine I got a problem. I can't, I tried to enslave the native inhabitants, that didn't work. For various reasons, disease, the fact that they could run to different places that we had to get totally control over. So I needed something, I needed somebody I needed an asset, I needed a working global asset that I could segregate, like a balance sheet. I segregate my assets on one side and the other side. So I needed to segregate an asset that if it ran away, it was always identified. Try to use white people, I can't find milk in milk. I can find oil and a glass of milk. I don't care in any way you divide. And I also, my buddies, we had an argument. The real argument about the mulatto. Was a mulatto a dark-skinned white person or a light-skinned black person? In order to maintain the control, I had to make a mulatto a light-skinned black person. Because I made a dark-skinned white person with all the political rights that afforded whiteness that I would lose control. So I had to come up with the one drop rule for my own economic interests. Now I might be wrong the way I'm looking at it, but to me that's where I dissect it. Okay, I need to reclaim that asset no matter where it comes. Well, I don't care if it goes to Canada. I don't care where it wants to. I need that asset to come back. I pay for it, and the multiplicative that comes out of that asset, if I create a system in which slaves make more slaves. So a female slave and a black slave is very valuable because I can look at it's an asset that reproduces itself over and over and over again. I always saw the political system come out of my mercantilist economic interests. So I had to create laws to maintain what I kept. And I'm not willing to dilute my interests. To make black people who are mixed race part of it, that I'm diluting it. And that was never my purpose in the first place when I came here. And I might be twisted, but that's
No, but I hear you completely. And that is the economic argument for slavery and for white supremacy. I'm only saying that if you take the economic argument, it makes sense up to a point because there's a whole nother set of things that are not explained.
Okay. Because I'll address another system that's a much older slave system that was purposed for the same reasons, and that was the slave trade. The Arab slave trade predates the European slave trade by almost 1,000 years. And it was premised on the same thing. There was a book called when the Arabs enslaved black men, they were castrated. They were castrated, and they were used for economic purposes. And they built a whole set of laws around black people in the Arab. in the Arab, Africa is very racist. I mean, I've been there, worked there. It's somewhat different than it is here in the United States.
Joe, do you mind if just because I know we're also running, getting to 2 o'clock, is I think also what Doc was saying earlier, which is we can debate the origins of slavery, where it comes from, but I think the more useful for our time in both understanding the system, but also the revolutionary path forward is what you were saying earlier, which is origins versus the dialectics of the evolution of it, which is that maybe the economic came before the political came before the economic. But at this moment in time, how do you explain something like the genocide of the Palestinians from a purely economic perspective?
Yeah, and I can explain it. They discovered in Gaza, outside of Gaza,
So if they were white people, you think we would bomb the heck out of this
in
people?
Gaza, okay, they found they believe the largest oil deposits in existence. Couldn't rival the deposits found in Saudi Arabia, offshore in Gaza. That's a fact. Okay, and the people, and so it's about economic interests in Gaza. That's the reason why you have this parlay going on between the Arabs and the Abraham Accord, because the Arabs know the oil is offshore in Gaza, and they want to make sure that it doesn't break OPEC.
But I think that Alice's question.
There's a mercantile interest.
No, I think Alice's question is important to answer. If the Palestinians were a white race, would you think that we would be bombing them?
Yes.
Can you show an example?
When has that ever happened?
That was economic. That was war over economic interest, because Germany.
No,
Germany
but
was
even
excluded.
during the
Germany was excluded out of the economic privilege of the colonial empire. That was the primary reason they went to war. World War I, World War II was, we are not sharing in the bounty of the colonial expansions of the French and primarily the British.
Well, what I was trying to say is that I think, like Doc was also saying, the economic principles that lay at the basis of the origin of a white supremacist world system is not under question. I think, enough has been said, it has been analyzed, and we are definitely on board with that. But I actually completely disagree that the Arab slave trade was anything like the transatlantic slave trade, because of what happened in history going forward, where it was not just the slave trade, but it was also the colonization of Asia and Africa. And then in modern times, every war being fought in an Asian country, genocide of a people always being a dark people that's genocided out of existence. Yes, you can talk about how certain white societies were decimated during World War II, but there wasn't systematic genocide against any white people. And I think the reason why, the Holocaust is such a touchstone for so many people in history is that's the first instance of white people doing this to white people. And that's why it has to be treated as something like an exception, a historic point that we must all remember and pay dues to. But genocide through famine, through war, through bombing, like Hiroshima, has always been perpetuated by the white man against the dark man historically, and that is what separates the Arab slave trade from the transatlantic slave trade. I think this is a talking point of people who.
I worked in Africa for 5 years, and there's an extensive volume of work that's being produced about the hidden history of the African Arab slave trade and what it did, and it's voluminous and it's extensive.
Well, but being voluminous does not make it substantive.
The Africans don't agree with that. I think
That's a very broad term to say the Africans.
the black Africans, right now, the intellectuals that's the big argument, but it doesn't.
But so I think the logical conclusion of your arguments essentially is that the underdevelopment of Africa, of Asia, is because they're inferior.
No, I said the Arabs enslaved the Africans, and it was based on race.
But Joe, the point I'm trying to make is this is an argument made by the white supremacist establishment to diminish the historic consequences of transatlantic slave trade. by saying that, oh, the Arabs also enslaved people. This is a talking point to try and diminish what departure, what rupture that
Like, we
caused.
haven't, the thing is, like, we haven't read the same things that you have. That's very true. And I think to Corbett's point, I've only heard the thing about the Arab slave trade.
Ranks tell you that Africans that teach at these major universities, email them, they'll give you a dossier that doesn't shop. The degree and extent of it, and how it disrupted African civilization in the last.
Okay, but to Corbett's point, I think, well, because you're making several claims, which I think all of which are arguable, which is why we're talking about it. And the thing is that, like what Corbett said, I've only ever heard the Arab slave trade narrative used basically by like white conservatives who are trying to say that transatlantic slave trade wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
Because throughout human history, slavery has happened, and therefore, actually, the white version, the white European version of slavery was actually probably the most humane version of slavery that's ever happened in human history. Because actually, look at how well Black people are doing. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the argument you're making, but I react to it from the same point of I've heard it used in that way. So that's why it's, I think it is. No, but I'm asking. I'm just saying, like, okay, yeah, I'm just saying. I'm saying this is like, for me, that's where I've heard it, and so I think it's understandable for like us, or I don't know. I can only speak for myself. For me to react to
If you have
something.
not actually it's quite known among
Yeah, but I think so
especially
there's that claim which you're making, but then the other claim, which is I think
but it's not a claim, it's a fact.
Would you call Islam in Africa an Arab colonialist?
Yes.
I think that other people jumped in, and so I might be repeating them. But yeah, I think that I've been hearing a lot about the Arab African slave trade from Africans, from white Americans, from Indians, to sort of, especially in this time, to say how backwards Arab people are. But if you look at the history,
No, I'm not saying they're backwards. They weren't backwards. I'm just saying.
Because I've also
places predicated on racial supremacy. That's all I'm saying.
but I would just, so that's where I'll disagree with you. And I would point out to the example of the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, because they were a slave caste, but they took political power, and they were the highest political power at the end of the day.
The Turks are Europeans.
So, but just to
You
say,
can't use the Turks are Europeans, and the Turks are not Arabs. You know that.
they were in charge of large parts of Africa
But
and Asia.
they're not Arabs, it's part of the empire.
But I would just use them as the example and say that other Arab countries, they took on slaves, and in Islam it's the history of it's in the Quran, you can take slaves, but it didn't produce a social system which kept those people in poverty. So it doesn't matter if it's the Janissaries or other slaves. The Arab slave trade didn't produce a social system. That's my difference.
It did through marriage. It did. But anyway, that's a side.
And also to your point with Africans, I would say just because they're African doesn't mean we agree with them off the bat. I think there are many, ideological.
No, I'm saying these are Africans explaining, intellectuals who are explaining their history, their experience with it, and they're starting to become very vulnerable.
Agreed, but I think
on the continent. And these are highly educated people who can trace and have great anthropological, both cultural and physical evidence.
yeah, but again, like I don't I don't even know these intellectuals, so I can't say definitively either way. But also to Samir's point, this whole thing of also like Arab people really hate Black people. This is proven throughout hundreds of years of history. I'm only, from my perspective as a young person who's like very online, I only really see that used as an argument basically for Black people to vote for the Democratic Party and to not care about genocide and violence. No, I'm talking about what I'm talking about, which is there are like I don't know what this is that you do, and I haven't read all the introductions that you have, but I can speak from what I see in terms of right now the political landscape in the United States, in which certain operatives, certain influencers on social media, especially for Black people, are trying to make the argument Arabs all hate Black people, Arabs enslaved us, therefore we should not really care about the genocide in Gaza because it's against Arabs and Arabs hate us. That's how I've seen it used. And I feel like that, whether or not you're even arguing that point, I don't know, but you kind of let us down that territory. And I'm responding to how certain historical claims get used in the contemporary.
Yeah,
That's all.
I'm saying that Merkel created the social constructs. Okay, and the question was, do I think what happening if Gaza was, you know, if the natural resources offshore didn't exist, that's the primary claimant. And when the Arabs, when the Israelis discovered oil, they made sure the Arabs in Gaza could not negotiate with the big oil companies to develop oil. When they found it,
So that was your first set of arguments, which I think is the most interesting part, because I think that's part of like the substance of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, until strictly Merkel, I think that Mercantilism drives
But can I say something?
the behavior.
Which is, the thing is that take Israel and Palestine. The only reason why Israel can exist to this day is because something has been reproduced in the people in Israel to support the state, which is white supremacy. Because even if the origins, and I don't even know the origins of Israel, even if the origins of Israel were because the West was like, yes, we need to control oil in this area, and we are going to go there for oil. How do you maintain a stable state there to extract oil generation after generation? The only way you can do it is if there's a white supremacist social system that where people, like your average Israeli is not like, I'm in Israel because I'm trying to extract oil. The protests in Israel are because they truly believe that every hostage that is killed is more valuable than tens of thousands of women and children in Palestine. Because they believe a Palestinian's life is worth less than one Israeli life. One Israeli life, two Israeli life, three Israeli life is worth like the extermination of a whole people in Palestine.
But I think that's Joe, apropos what you said. So do you see a line of connection between this, the state of Israel, and the transatlantic slave trade, or between the state of Israel and the Arab African slave trade? So you see my question? See, I think what she's arguing, which is a contemporary argument rooted in a kind of historical chronology,
Right.
that the white supremacist social system emerges from the transatlantic slave trade and the need to distinguish the slave traders and their population as white people from the Africans. We have no evidence. You say the Arabs are racist. Well, Arabs are people that speak Arab language. So you got Arabs in Sudan, you got Arabs in Palestine, and you got Arabs in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, I think, who are different Arabs.
You know, there was I don't want to get off the topic.
Yes, but no, I'm just saying, but just on this, could I just ask another question? We're making a hard claim, and we could be wrong, Joe. We make the claim that the Democratic Party, based upon our analysis of this historical chronology, is the instrument of the white supremacist social system and the most white supremacist political party in the world today. Is that claim too strong, or would you want to modify it?
Well, the Democratic Party represents the financial, military, industrial, global complex. And that's what's underfoot. And in order, I'm looking at it as a bank. As a banker, I want to protect my assets. Those assets can be both human and non-human. And I will go to any extent to make sure that I can exercise claims against those assets. And to me, that's what the laws throughout. that need to make sure that I'm able to.
But isn't that the problem? You're looking at it from the standpoint of a class that you're not a part of. And I'm saying if you look at one of the things,
In other words, to do the analysis, you don't have to belong to the class. All you have to do is look at it. Math is math. Math works no matter what. The oil sells for this amount of money, and it's this amount of oil in the ground. I can do a multiplication of it and figure out.
can I ask a question? See, one of the things we began with is if we look at this from the standpoint of the Black poor, not just but there's 20 generations of poverty. If we look at it from that standpoint, it is at best irrational for the bankers and the class of them to continue this system, which in a certain sense destabilizes the system. So why are they so invested in it? I don't know whether I'm making myself. Why?
Because
Is it because of the economic benefits?
the more you create, the more.
But you see my point. You see my point. See, there's a point at which I think the argument that we've been working on since early this morning and before explains what is unexplained by the economic analysts. Now, maybe next week you could come back with an argument that says, no, the economic argument will explain what you say is unexplained. But at this point, you see what I'm saying? I don't think that a financier.
And I think that's how political, because within academia, this argument we're having right now has existed ongoing. Is it economics or is it politics? Or is it, what comes first? Economic interest or political interest?
Or what we said, the social systemic. We said the social system. And to explain certain phenomena, that is normally swept under the rug. You have to have this systemic approach. And it includes the economic, but that does not privilege the economic, does not privilege the banker, the corporate executive, but looks at things that they do not look at. Include in the first place, let's start Black poverty. And I say Black poverty is, first of all, Black poverty defines what it means to be Black. I mean, it really does. That's right. Yeah. When you say Black, you literally mean poverty. And so, that is, that's all. So I think that,
I guess what I'm
saying, I think from the standpoint
of the laws, people who have financial power have to create an accumulation of laws to make sure that they interfere in the social system to the extent and degree.
Can I ask you a question? Explain Plessy v. Ferguson. Explain that. I don't think it's an purely economic explanation of that. You could say, a need to create opportunities for white immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Well, maybe, or was it a part of a larger systemic project? And we could talk more about that. The defeat of Reconstruction, defeat of the South, the whole class system in the South had collapsed. And this is what Emily's point is, to create a single social system. What were the terms of and I think here is, I just, and I could be wrong, believe me, I can see that I could be wrong, I could be overstating, I could be exaggerating. But to explain what is unexplained by both liberal theorizing, Marxist or radical theorizing, you have to widen the lens. You have to widen the perspective. And I think that is by asserting the existence of a white supremacist social system that I don't think you would disagree with.
Well, I agree 100%.
Yeah, but then Okay, but what are the consequences of that
I
agreement?
think, for example, it was the British to finance the Confederacy of World War II. They issued cotton bonds because Britain controlled the cotton, the markets. And it was the Rothschild that floated the bonds.
But I don't disagree with that. But all of that occurs within the framework of a social system.
Right. But the laws that they create.
Yes, but, and in the, yes.
You take the lobbyists. The lobbyists in Washington DC don't write any of those laws. They bring in.
I don't know what they like or don't like, but I do know one thing. Without the existence of the white supremacist social system, which they call democracy, and thus the extreme examples of Black misery, Black impoverishment, Black everything that is bad. In fact, the definition of everything that is wrong with the society, you could literally put the name Black on. You see what I'm saying? So how do you explain? It has to be something larger.
To me, whoever controls capital, whoever controls money, in its wide spectrum and its uses that can be deployed.
But see, I would make the argument that money means little without a social system that values money. You see what I'm saying? The money itself is a product of the social system.
Right. Well, I also wanted to throw in, I mean, consider all of the discourse about, say, the Indian government and Modi that comes from this country, right? The I forget what was the Heidelberg Institute or whatever came out with this report on the Modi administration and how they have colluded with big business and the big capitalist class. And this goes to what Joe's argument is about, whoever controls the money basically controls the law and controls the terms on which people's economic or social reality. But then I think this, like, I'm going to state it, but I don't think anybody would disagree, is that even in the context of India, Modi being, in the whatever, being colluding with the big capitalist class or whatever, the social system it creates in India does not operate the same way as when the white supremacist ruling elite in this country controls the means of the economic institutions of this country. There is a difference to be made, and I think I'm not saying this very well, but what I'm trying to say is that by equating or by just saying that whoever controls the money is basically who decides what the social.
Can I just to support an argument? I'm so influenced by them because they're Indians, they're from India. And so you say, well, capitalist countries have similar social systems. So they coming from India, it should be very familiar, a capitalist culture, capitalist system, money rules, and all that type of thing. They had no idea where they were. I mean, they didn't know from Buster. What is going on? They had no concept of race. In fact, I take Emily's parents. I mean, if you don't know, they're only now beginning to halfway understand where they are. So if the capitalist system produces the social system and similar cultures, why is it so unfamiliar to them?
Well, it produces itself in Australia. It produces itself in
well, let's talk about Australia.
And again, it was the Black. It was the natives.
But it's the white that Israel, Australia, New Zealand, England, most of Europe have taken on features of the American system, the white supremacist system, in the place of colonialism. Just like
the British Empire was a it preceded.
But Dig, Joe, they are so unfamiliar. It's almost laughable at times. They had no idea of where they were. They went to the University of Illinois. They stayed in their dormitories because they didn't know what was going. And what their greatest ambition. As soon as we finish this, we're going back to India, to the homeland.
I mean,
they didn't know.
We were also products of British colonialism, but that is, but what that left us with, or that is completely different from what
Oh,
is
I agree
here.
with that. I was just explaining the fact that as a mercantilist, I came to a new land. I had to make sure I had to have a slave that I could find past. I don't want it to just disappear. If I can't get it, they tried the Indians, it didn't work. Then they tried white people, it didn't work because the whites ran away. I couldn't find it. I had to get an asset.
Well,
But I think that's a little simplistic.
And
Don't
that
you
was-
think that you can't find the whites if you don't want to
Well,
find them?
It was very
Okay.
hard. It was very hard. It was very hard to enslave whites. They tried.
well,
Indentureship.
do you mind if I jump in?
Sure.
I think this is also something that's very sensitive for, I mean, I can speak for myself, which is that the position that you're coming from essentially says that the poverty in this country and the wars in the world are essentially things that are inevitable because people will, as a business person, banker, everyone's just out for their own interests. And I think what we are trying to say is that the view has to be broader because someone like King, which is that it's not just a choice between, let me finish. It's not just a choice of, can I make more money? But as a human being, is there something that's more important than just money? And obviously, like, we talk about poverty and it is important that people have what they need to live. But there's another dimension, which is the human heart. And let me finish, which is that, for example, if you're going to say the mindset of a mercantilist, or I forget how you pronounce it, which is that their motive is always just to make more money. And so if this decision is, if I'm at a crossroads of what decision to make, money is the sole determinant and not what's right. And the example that we have, and why is it that we always talk about immigrants in this country? If we follow the economic mode of determination, then immigrants in this country, whatever they do, it makes sense. They come here, they don't need to care about Black people. And this is common of Chinese Americans in this country. They open up a restaurant, a takeout restaurant, where the food is so shitty and they only sell it to Black people. And what we're trying to argue here is that there's something more than the economic mode, which is that we don't want to be immigrants to this country that are choosing their own self-interest over their selling their soul. No.
I was explaining, look,
No.
what I'm saying is that when you look at mercantilism and what it brings you, and what I'm saying is that they created laws to maintain and still contain this.
But why is your perspective the banker or the mercantile, and rather than
because
the press?
I don't see that. In other words, until this is my position, until you destroy the mercantile class,
And how do you do that?
okay, and how you destroy the mercantile class is the same way Russia and China are doing it now. That's the reason why we're headed for war, because it's the end of European and American control of the world economic system of resources and returns. That's the reason why they create BRICS. BRICS is an alternative to the dollar. It's an alternative to the whole 500-year colonial experiment of world domination.
No, and we agree with you on that part, but I think you even speaking about Russia and China, and I'm less familiar with the Russian situation and more familiar with China,
Right.
which is that in order to have, those are products of a revolution of the people. And what we're talking about here is that a revolution here is going to have to be based on where is it that people are morally, spiritually. And what we are saying is that the Black poor, they are conscious of their oppression. And that,
It should be my whole family's good. Okay.
so you're speaking, but actually that's what I'm saying.
I live it. It's not like, for example, like the church I go to is Rehoboth. It's in North Philly. Okay, all my family's North Philly. Okay, I was here with King. I was here with King. Now, I was in the Black Panther. Okay, so this is not an exercise intellectualism. Okay, what I'm saying is that humanity that you're talking about, I don't see it being manifested or can ever be manifested until you destroy the financial system. until you destroy the bankers, until you destroy that class, it'll never stop. And I think that's my opinion is what is going on right now. Like Russia and China, I know how it came about. This conflict between them is all about geopolitics, natural resources, and that oil is offshore in Gaza. If you Google the offshore deposits, those deposits are astounding. They say they can rival Saudi Arabia. And even if there were people there, they could be Yugoslavians, they could be whatever they want. They would kill those people.
No, and I get your point, which is, I guess one last thing, which is that what we're trying to say is that for many of us, we're here in America. And China can do its thing, Russia can do its thing, we can be a counterbalance to the American state, but something also has to happen here. That will have to come from the people who feel that this ruling elite that includes the bankers that you're talking about have to be overthrown. Because I think what we went through today is, for many in this country, they have signed a contract, signed this agreement with the ruling elite, which is you can do whatever you want as long as you protect us. Right. But what we're saying right now is that, what do you do? Well, one, are there people already who don't agree to this contract? Because you're saying the financial class, the banker class has to be overthrown, but who's going to overthrow them? Like China can do its thing, whatever, or Russia can do its thing. But what we're saying here is that someone here has to do that. And the overthrow, we've talked about like, what is the strategy of free school? What is the strategy of Black freedom movements?
I guess my question is, in order to, what are you going to replace it?
And that's what we're talking about here.
What kind of economic system would you political and economic system would you replace it? That's what I'm saying.
Well, actually, what you're saying in the conversation made me think that the reason why to even say white supremacist social system, that this country produced a white supremacist social system that came out of the fall of Reconstruction, is because actually, in some ways, you could say British imperialism, like straight up colonialism, was an economic theory. It was basically, they believed colonialism completely depended on the idea that we can just purely extract resources from Africa and Asia, and that will be okay. But the problem with that is that if all you're doing is this, in some ways, an economic strategy dependent on degrading the human beings and destroying civilizations, it will not actually lead to the long success of like the British Empire, because the people in Asia and Africa will always seek freedom and fight. And so what happened in America is, in some ways, the white supremacist social system, what it does is it's not meant to just economically control people. What in some ways in some ways you could say it's such a fucking advanced invention, because what it does is it basically, and it's something that then is exported, the rest of the world used it. Now the British use it, all these Western countries use it, why it's all considered the West, it's not just about, we're not just extracting, it's not straight up slavery, it's not straight up colonialism, but instead it's the belief that we are all equal. Okay, we're all equal, we emancipated the slaves, we're all equal, but there's such thing as a first class and second class citizen, and it is legalized according to racial identity. And in some ways that's much more advanced. It's not colonialism, it's a white supremacist social system where it's not really, in some ways you're kind of like hiding the real like fucked up relations between human beings in America.
It's called neoliberalism, that's what they call it.
Just one thing, can we look at here the comments and then we'll come back?
Comment section is bad.
It's bad. It's like there are like 50,000 comments and people are just arguing amongst themselves. There are definitely some trolls. There's some white supremacists in there. There's some very bigoted in there.
I think it's robots.
It's like there's some. It's not really. And people parsing.
It's real.
It's like people saw that the video is called "White Supremacist Social System" in the Democratic Party, and so then it attracted all the like AI, artificial intelligence created accounts to that says see the word white supremacy and are like, and then come and leave comments. Leave comments that are like not real by real people necessarily, but leaving comments that are white. Wait, can I?
I think that mostly.
I actually think my hypothesis is actually that okay, so before Reconstruction, there was no white supremacist social system that united the whole country. But because of slavery, it forced Black people to create a Black radical social system, the Black church, like music, and so when Reconstruction happened and Black people were emancipated, and then now that Black people are emancipated, they actually started doing what they were supposed to do, which is we're going to start creating governments with free education. We're going to start from the ground. That seeing that forced white people to develop a white supremacist social system in reaction to an emerging Black revolutionary social system that could potentially create a whole revolutionary state. That really freaked me.
I agree with that. I would just refine it a little bit more. But I think the thesis, the hypothesis is well grounded. Definitely to stabilize society. And that is the framework, society. If it were not society, you could just have a bunch of capitalists, but you have society, you have a state, you have religion, you have all of that for a certain reason, and but anyway, I can just refine it.
Okay.
Tell me more about these comments, AI generated.
Yeah, some of them are real and some of them are.
Some of them must be real.
No, some of them are.
Look, 50,000 comments.
It's not 50,000. That was an exaggeration. It's like maybe 200 comments. 250.
Oh, Brandon Stanford loved it.
Okay, that's a real person.
Look at this one.
I'm not sure. Maybe if somebody
It
thought
said
that.
physical whiteness and sociological whiteness are not the same thing. Bacon's rebellion initiates the invention of whiteness to combat the interracial coalition's rebellion. The book, In the Matter of Color, shows you all of the laws that are put in place as a result of Bacon's rebellion. For example, the practice of white supremacy with its carefully constructed combination, knockout punches, comprised of policies, regulations, racialized science, and laws that painstakingly advantaged many of these.
I think one of the arguments about indentured slavery and Bacon's rebellion is that Blacks and whites were indentured servants, and that Bacon's rebellion led to the emergence of a distinction based differentiating indentured servitude from slavery. But keep going.
It's hard for me to
I can't find it.
Yeah, I can't find the rest of the comment. Sorry.
Maybe.
Magna left a comment, which is what Doc is saying about bourgeois liberalism is a white supremacist social system, reminding me of this quote from Black Reconstruction. Quote, America thus stepped forward in the first blossoming of the modern age and added to the art of beauty, gift of the Renaissance, into freedom of belief, gift of Martin Luther and Leo X, a vision of democratic self-government, the domination of political life by the intelligent decision of free and self-sustaining men. It was the supreme adventure in the last great battle of the West for that human freedom which would release the human spirit from lower lust for mere meat and set it free to dream and sing. And then some unjust God leaned, laughing, over the ramparts of heaven and dropped a Black man in the midst. It transformed the world. It turned democracy back to Roman imperialism and fascism. It restored caste and oligarchy. It replaced freedom with slavery and withdrew the name of humanity from the vast majority of human beings.
Can I say something? really quickly, I just wanted to say is that if the economic system is what is primarily driving this society, community, and people's lives, then I think the point that we were making today, why are the majority of Black people poor, would not be a thing. If capitalism was, as an economic system, unbiased, everybody would have the same amount of opportunity to make it. But I think it's the social system that is the door that you have to, like, pay an entry fee to cross into, that you're allowed to assimilate, essentially. And this is also why I feel like I don't really agree if Palestine was a white European country like France, Italy, or Scotland, that they would be bombed. They would be given an invitation to assimilate and share the oil. But the only instances in history where you pointed out, like World War I and World War II, where white Europeans were fighting other white Europeans, which were in recent memory, that happened because this opportunity to assimilate didn't work out. But then you look at the hundreds and thousands of times that the darker people in different parts of the world, in Asia and Africa, their resources have been stolen from them. There was no offer of assimilation. There was just extraction by force. So you have a lot of examples, a lot of examples of one kind where you have an evidence of the existence of this system, and then you have a few exceptions. And I just choose to believe the majority of what has happened. I don't think that if Palestine was a land full of white people, they would be bombed. They would be given a chance to share whatever the offshore oil reserves are, and they would, because they benefit. But yeah.
Also, to the commenters, I know that especially if you're watching Free School for the first time, especially if you're a real person and not a bot, if you're watching Free School the first time, it's very confusing as to who these people are, why we're talking, like what is the basis upon which we're having this conversation, and that's all fine. But I would say I think there is a problem which I also have, of like when you're really online, it's really easy to not listen at all and to just react constantly, which is I feel like what happened today with the comment section. And I understand that people, especially if you're not like familiar with us, like it may be confusing, like who are these people? Why are they all like having this conversation and all that? But I do think it's important to try to listen and to not always react all the time. And I know that the internet as a whole conditions people to always be constantly reacting and like to try to get like quick whatever bites of like, I don't know, like takedowns or whatever. But yeah, like I mean, you can look at all the past videos as well, like all the previous live streams, all the events that we've done. And we're not doing this just to try to get likes and hits and stuff, but we're actually trying to do like, yeah, like we're trying to do philosophical work, which is like actually pretty challenging. And we invite people to give feedback and to give input on that work that we're doing, but no amount of comments, the barrage of comments that we get, is ever going to change what we're actually trying to do during this case. So.
Needed to be said twice.
Yeah.
Maybe we can end for today.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do
Most
we end?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's already past 2 today. We had a really good, lively discussion. And thanks for your introduction, Doc. I'm gonna have to re-listen to it. Yeah, I think we're on to the next stage. And it's completely around this. And you need to know the white supremacist social system in order to see why the Democratic Party is so thick and at the vanguard of it. And so we'll end for today, but we'll be back next week. And I'm just gonna end the live stream. So goodbye to all. commenters.